Amidst the heat of Brazil's sprawling favelas, where desperation bleeds into violence and justice becomes a twisted game of survival, one name carved itself into the nation's darkest nightmares with the precision of a butcher's blade. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Padrinho Matador, transformed from victim to predator, from broken child to Brazil's most merciless executioner. With hands stained crimson by the blood of over 100 souls, this walking embodiment of vengeance stalked through decades of carnage, turning prisons into hunting grounds and streets into graveyards. His kill count reads like a demonic ledger: 70 confirmed murders that earned him 128 years behind bars, 40 more corpses littering prison corridors, and countless others whose screams were swallowed by the unforgiving darkness of Brazil's criminal underworld. This is not merely the story of a killer. This is the chronicle of a human predator who rewrote the rules of murder itself, transforming every breath into a calculated hunt and every heartbeat into a countdown to death. Prepare yourself for a journey into the abyss of human cruelty, where redemption dies and only the monster survives. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story, The Devil's Ledger, Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Brazil's most prolific killer. The year was 1954, and in the poverty-stricken outskirts of Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Minas Gerais, the universe conspired to birth its most ruthless creation. Pedro Rodrigues Filho entered the world not with the innocent cry of a newborn, but with what would become the first whisper of a death sentence that would echo through decades of bloodshed. From the moment his infant skull pressed against his mother's bruised womb, violence had already begun its insidious work. His father's brutal fists had rained down upon his pregnant mother with such savage frequency that baby Pedro emerged into this world bearing the physical scars of domestic warfare. A damaged skull that would forever mark him as different, as dangerous, as damned. The deformity was more than cosmetic. It was prophetic. Where other children's heads bore the smooth curves of innocence, Pedro's skull carried the jagged landscape of violence, a topographical map of abuse that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The injury had warped not just bone, but perhaps something deeper, something that would transform this child into Brazil's most prolific angel of death. His childhood unfolded like a horror story written in blood and tears. The family's descent into poverty was as brutal as it was inevitable. His father, a man whose own demons danced behind bloodshot eyes, wielded his rage like a weapon of mass destruction within the confines of their ramshackle home. Each day brought fresh bruises, new wounds, and the gradual erosion of whatever humanity might have existed in young Pedro's soul. But it wasn't just the physical abuse that forged the monster. It was the psychological warfare that accompanied each beating, each humiliation, each moment where hope died a little more. Pedro's mother, herself a victim trapped in the cyclone of domestic violence, could offer no sanctuary. She became both witness and fellow sufferer in this theater of cruelty, her own survival depending on staying invisible when her husband's fury erupted like a volcano of hate. The streets of Santa Rita do Sapucaí offered no respite from the nightmare at home. This was a place where children grew up fast or didn't grow up at all, where survival meant developing instincts sharper than broken glass and deadlier than poison. Pedro learned early that the world respected only one language, violence, and he would become fluent in its darkest dialects. By the age of 13, the transformation was already beginning. Where other teenagers struggled with homework and first crushes, Pedro was calculating revenge with the cold precision of a seasoned executioner. The catalyst came in the form of his first taste of betrayal. His father had been cheating on his mother, adding adultery to the growing list of sins that demanded retribution. But fate had an even more twisted surprise waiting. Pedro's father didn't just destroy his family through infidelity, he destroyed it through murder. The man who had already killed his son's innocence now literally killed someone else, adding homicide to his repertoire of brutality. When Pedro learned of this, something fundamental shifted in his already damaged psyche. The line between victim and victimizer didn't just blur, it evaporated entirely. The seeds of vigilante justice took root in soil fertilized by years of abuse and neglect. Pedro's moral compass, already shattered by childhood trauma, began pointing in a direction that would lead to decades of carnage. He started to see himself not as a damaged child seeking healing, but as an instrument of divine retribution, a corrector of cosmic injustices. His first kill came at the tender age of 14, an age when most children are worried about pimples and popularity contests. But Pedro Rodriguez Filio was no ordinary child. He had been forged in the fires of abuse and tempered in the waters of revenge. His target was the vice mayor of Alfenas, a man Pedro believed was responsible for his father's firing from a security job. The murder was not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution. Pedro stalked his prey with the patience of a professional assassin, studying routines, mapping escape routes, planning every detail with methodical precision. When the moment came, he struck with a violence that would become his signature, brutal, personal, and utterly merciless. The killing should have horrified him, should have triggered remorse or fear or some semblance of human emotion. Instead, it awakened something dark and hungry within him. The act of taking a life didn't repulse Pedro, it exhilarated him. The power of holding someone's existence in his hands, of deciding who lived and who died, filled a void that nothing else could touch. Word of the murder spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. Here was a 14-year-old boy who had killed an adult with the cold efficiency of a seasoned hitman. Some whispered he was cursed, others that he was blessed with a killer's instinct. Pedro himself saw it differently. He was simply fulfilling his destiny as an agent of justice in a world where the corrupt went unpunished and the innocent suffered in silence. The transformation from victim to predator was now complete. Pedro's childhood had ended not with graduation or celebration, but with murder. The damaged skull that had marked him from birth now housed the mind of a killer, and Brazil was about to discover what happened when a monster learned to hunt. As he disappeared into the shadows of the criminal underground, leaving behind the corpse of the vice mayor and the last remnants of his innocence, Pedro Rodriguez Filio began his evolution into something far more terrifying than a mere murderer. He was becoming a force of nature, a walking embodiment of retribution, a predator whose appetite for blood would prove insatiable. The boy who had been broken by violence was about to break the world with it. And this was only the beginning of a killing spree that would span decades, claim over 100 lives, and earn him a place in the pantheon of history's most feared serial killers. The monster had been born. Now it was time for him to hunt. The transformation of Pedro Rodriguez Filio from damaged child to apex predator wasn't an overnight metamorphosis. It was a systematic evolution into something that defied every conventional understanding of human nature. By the time he reached his 20s, Pedro had already established himself as Brazil's most feared vigilante killer, a shadow that moved through the criminal underworld with the silent efficiency of death itself. His methodology was as terrifying as it was effective. Unlike random serial killers who struck without pattern or purpose, Pedro operated with the calculated precision of a divine executioner. Every target was chosen with deliberate care, every murder planned with military precision, every death serving his twisted interpretation of cosmic justice. The criminal networks of Brazil learned to whisper his name only in the darkest corners, where even seasoned killers felt the chill of fear creep up their spines. Pedrinho Matador had become more than a man. He was a living nightmare that stalked through their ranks, dispensing his own brand of lethal judgment to those he deemed deserving of death. His reputation spread like a plague through the favelas and urban hellscapes where violence was currency and survival depended on knowing who posed the greatest threat. Pedro had surpassed every other predator in the ecosystem, establishing himself at the apex of Brazil's food chain of death. Drug dealers, corrupt officials, rival gang members, and anyone who crossed his increasingly complex moral code found themselves marked for execution. The brutality of his kills became his signature, a calling card written in blood that left investigators both horrified and fascinated. Pedro didn't simply murder his victims, he obliterated them. Each death was a masterpiece of violence, painted with techniques that seemed to come from some hellish instruction manual that only he possessed. His first notable massacre occurred in Sao Paulo, where Pedro had tracked down a group of men responsible for the death of his pregnant girlfriend. The loss of both lover and unborn child had triggered something primal in Pedro's already damaged psyche, transforming grief into an unstoppable engine of revenge. The men had believed they were safe, hidden in the labyrinthine networks of Sao Paulo's criminal underground. They were wrong. Pedro's hunt for these killers lasted months, during which he systematically dismantled their organization piece by piece. He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to suffer, to understand the horror they had unleashed, to experience the same helpless terror his girlfriend must have felt in her final moments. When he finally cornered them, the slaughter was so savage that even hardened criminals who discovered the scene afterward spoke of it only in horrified whispers. Bodies weren't just killed. They were destroyed, torn apart with a ferocity that suggested Pedro had accessed some reservoir of rage that existed beyond normal human emotion. The forensic evidence painted a picture of carnage that defied comprehension. Multiple stab wounds delivered with surgical precision, designed not for quick death but for maximum agony. Dismemberment performed with tools that suggested Pedro had studied anatomy, learning exactly how to disassemble the human form while keeping his victims conscious for as long as possible. But what truly terrified investigators was the evidence of psychological torture that preceded the physical destruction. Pedro had held these men captive, subjecting them to hours or possibly days of mental anguish before finally granting them the mercy of death. He had perfected the art of breaking the human spirit before breaking the human body. This pattern would repeat throughout his killing spree, each murder serving as both execution and education for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to cross his path. Pedro's kill count began climbing with astronomical speed, his name becoming synonymous with a particular brand of biblical vengeance that left no room for mercy or reprieve. His targets weren't chosen randomly. They were selected with the precision of a master craftsman choosing the perfect materials for his work. Corrupt police officers who sold protection to criminals found themselves stalked through the very streets they had once patrolled. Drug lords who poisoned communities discovered that their wealth and security couldn't protect them from Pedro's relentless pursuit. One particularly notorious killing involved a police officer who had been selling information to rival gangs, directly contributing to the deaths of innocent civilians caught in crossfire. Pedro spent weeks studying this man's routine, learning his habits, identifying his weaknesses. The officer believed his badge and connections made him untouchable. The murder scene told a different story. Pedro had cornered the corrupt cop in his own home, turning the man's sanctuary into a chamber of horrors. The evidence suggested a prolonged encounter, during which Pedro had methodically extracted confessions of every corrupt act, every betrayal, every innocent life lost due to this man's greed. The officer's body bore wounds that read like a catalog of his crimes. Each corrupt deal carved into his flesh, each betrayal written in blood across his skin. Pedro had transformed murder into autobiography, forcing his victim to wear his sins as he died. As his reputation grew, so did his confidence and his appetite for increasingly challenging targets. Prison officials who turned blind eyes to inmate abuse, judges who sold verdicts to the highest bidder, politicians who enriched themselves while their constituents starved, all found themselves added to Pedro's ever-expanding hit list. The Brazilian authorities faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you catch a killer who operates with the precision of law enforcement but exists completely outside legal boundaries? Pedro had become a force of nature, an unstoppable hurricane of violence that left destruction in its wake, while somehow managing to remain always one step ahead of capture. His kills weren't just murders. They were public service announcements written in blood, messages sent to Brazil's criminal class that no amount of corruption, wealth, or protection could shield them from his particular brand of justice. Each corpse served as both punishment for the deceased and warning for the living. By his mid-20s, Pedro had accumulated a body count that surpassed most serial killers' lifetime totals. Conservative estimates suggested he had already killed dozens, but those who knew him best whispered that the true number was far higher. He had become a one-man genocide, systematically eliminating what he perceived as the cancer-corrupting Brazilian society. The psychological toll of such extensive killing should have destroyed him, should have left him a broken shell of humanity consumed by guilt and madness. Instead, Pedro seemed to thrive on the violence, drawing energy and purpose from each death he orchestrated. He had found his calling, his reason for existence, his divine mission. But even the most efficient killing machine eventually faces limitations. Pedro's success had made him overconfident, and overconfidence, as any predator knows, can quickly transform the hunter into the hunted. The Brazilian justice system was finally closing in on their most wanted fugitive, and Pedro Rodrigues Filho was about to discover that even monsters can be caged. The concrete walls of Carandiru Penitentiary had witnessed unspeakable horrors throughout their blood-soaked history, but nothing had prepared this fortress of despair for the arrival of Pedro Rodrigues Filho in 1973. At 19 years old, with dozens of murders already carved into his lethal resume, Pedro was about to discover that imprisonment wouldn't end his killing spree. It would simply provide him with a fresh hunting ground and a captive audience of victims. The arrest had come not through brilliant police work, but through the inevitable mathematics of violence. Even the most careful predator eventually makes a mistake, and Pedro's error came in the form of witnesses who survived long enough to identify him. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Brazilian history up to that point, involving hundreds of officers and consuming resources that could have funded small wars. When they finally cornered him, Pedro didn't resist. He surrendered with the calm resignation of a man who understood that this was simply the next chapter in his story, not the end of it. The arresting officers, expecting to find a frothing madman, instead encountered something far more disturbing. A composed, articulate young man who discussed his murders with the detached professionalism of someone describing their daily commute. The trial was a media sensation that gripped Brazil's attention with the force of a national catastrophe. Pedro's confession wasn't the rambling testimony of a deranged killer, but a methodical recounting of his crimes delivered with such precise detail that even seasoned prosecutors felt their blood run cold. He described murders with the clinical accuracy of a medical examiner, complete with explanations of his methodology and reasoning behind each execution. The sentence was unprecedented in Brazilian judicial history: 128 years imprisonment for 70 confirmed murders. It was a number so staggering that it seemed more like a mathematical equation than a criminal sentence. But Pedro knew, as did everyone else in that courtroom, that Brazilian law limited prison sentences to a maximum of 30 years. He would serve his time, and if he survived, he would walk free in middle age with decades of potential killing still ahead of him. What the authorities didn't anticipate was how completely Pedro would transform prison life into his own personal execution chamber. Carandiru Penitentiary was already a hellhole of violence and corruption when Pedro arrived, but his presence elevated the carnage to levels that defied human comprehension. Within weeks of his arrival, bodies began appearing with disturbing regularity, all bearing the distinctive marks of Pedro's particular brand of justice. His first prison victim was a convicted child molester who had made the fatal mistake of bragging about his crimes within Pedro's earshot. The man was found 3 days later in his cell, his body bearing wounds that suggested he had endured hours of methodical torture before finally being granted the mercy of death. Pedro had carved his disapproval directly into the man's flesh, creating a grotesque canvas of retribution. The prison administration faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't protect every inmate from Pedro without essentially placing the entire facility in lockdown, but they also couldn't ignore the growing pile of corpses that seemed to appear whenever Pedro decided someone deserved to die. He had essentially become a judge, jury, and executioner operating within their walls, dispensing his own brand of justice to those he deemed unworthy of continued existence. Pedro's methodology within prison was even more refined than his street killings had been. Confined spaces and limited resources had forced him to become more creative, more efficient, more terrifyingly precise in his executions. He fashioned weapons from everyday objects, transforming toothbrushes into stilettos, bed springs into garrotes, and eating utensils into instruments of surgical death. His reputation spread through Brazil's prison system like a contagion of fear. Inmates who had terrorized communities on the outside found themselves cowering in their cells, knowing that Pedro's moral code might mark them for elimination. Child molesters, rapists, those who had harmed the elderly or innocent, all discovered that prison walls couldn't protect them from Pedro's relentless pursuit of his twisted version of justice. The psychological warfare he employed was as devastating as his physical attacks. Pedro would study potential victims for weeks or months, learning their routines, their fears, their weaknesses. He would then begin a campaign of psychological torture designed to break their minds before he broke their bodies. Threatening notes would appear in impossible locations, personal items would vanish and reappear in different cells, and the victim would slowly realize that nowhere was safe. No hour of day or night offered sanctuary from Pedro's attention. One particularly notorious case involved a gang leader who had been responsible for recruiting children into drug trafficking. Pedro spent months preparing for this execution, not just planning the physical act but orchestrating a psychological masterpiece that would serve as a lesson to anyone else considering similar crimes. The gang leader began finding photographs of his victims, the children whose lives he had destroyed, placed strategically around his cell and personal belongings. Each photograph was accompanied by detailed descriptions of what had happened to these children after they entered his organization. Pedro had somehow acquired intimate knowledge of every life this man had ruined, every family he had destroyed, every future he had stolen. The psychological pressure was relentless and inescapable. The gang leader couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function as the weight of his crimes was methodically laid before him in an exhibition of guilt and consequence. When Pedro finally struck, the man was already broken, reduced to a trembling shell of his former self who actually seemed grateful when death finally arrived. The murder itself was a work of art in the medium of violence. Pedro had arranged the scene to tell the story of the man's crimes, positioning the body and evidence in ways that created a narrative of justice served. Prison guards who discovered the scene later described it as both horrifying and somehow beautiful, a grotesque masterpiece that conveyed meaning beyond mere death. As Pedro's prison kill count climbed, his legend grew to mythical proportions. Stories of his exploits spread through Brazil's criminal underworld, creating a folklore of fear that transcended the physical boundaries of prison walls. Criminals on the outside began modifying their behavior, aware that someday they might face Pedro's judgment and wanting to ensure they wouldn't be found wanting. Prison officials attempted various strategies to contain Pedro's killing spree. They placed him in solitary confinement, but he somehow continued to orchestrate deaths from isolation. They moved him between facilities, but each new prison soon experienced its own surge in inmate mortality. They tried pairing him with dangerous cellmates, but these men inevitably became his next victims. The most disturbing aspect of Pedro's prison career wasn't the killing itself. It was how he managed to maintain the support and even admiration of many fellow inmates. His selective targeting of those he deemed truly evil had earned him a reputation as a protector of the innocent, a guardian angel for those who couldn't protect themselves. Inmates who followed his moral code found themselves under his protection, while those who violated it discovered why he was called Matador. Pedro had essentially established himself as the unofficial ruler of Brazil's prison system, dispensing justice according to his own moral framework while corrections officers watched helplessly from the sidelines. He had transformed incarceration from punishment into opportunity, using his imprisonment as a platform to expand his killing spree rather than end it. By the time he had served 15 years, Pedro's official prison body count had reached 40 confirmed kills. Though guards and inmates whispered that the true number was significantly higher, he had turned imprisonment into an art form, demonstrating that bars and walls couldn't contain a mind dedicated to the craft of death. But even in this environment where he reigned supreme, Pedro was about to face challenges that would test his skills in ways he had never imagined. The Brazilian justice system was evolving, and new players were about to enter the game with their own agendas for Brazil's most notorious killer. The monster in the cage was about to discover that even apex predators could become prey. The year 2007 marked a seismic shift in Pedro Rodrigues Filho's bloody odyssey through Brazil's justice system. After 34 years behind bars, Years that had seen him transform from the nation's most feared street killer into its most notorious prison executioner. Pedro faced something he had never encountered before: freedom. Brazilian law had finally caught up with time, and his maximum sentence had been served, regardless of the mountain of corpses he had left in his wake. The prospect of Pedro's release sent shockwaves through Brazilian society that registered on a scale typically reserved for natural disasters. Here was a man who had killed with such methodical efficiency that his body count had become the stuff of nightmares, suddenly about to walk free among a population that had grown up hearing whispered tales of his exploits. The media coverage was relentless, with every news outlet running speculative pieces about what this aging but still dangerous predator might do with his newfound liberty. Pedro emerged from Carandiru Penitentiary as a changed man, though whether that change represented evolution or further devolution into darkness remained terrifyingly unclear. 3 decades of confinement had weathered his features, turning the young killer into a grizzled veteran of violence whose eyes held depths of experience that few human beings could comprehend. The deformed skull that had marked him from birth now seemed less like a birth defect and more like a crown of thorns, a visible reminder of the brutality that had shaped every moment of his existence. His first taste of freedom should have been sweet, but Pedro discovered that the world had moved on without him. The Brazil of 2007 was a different nation from the one he had terrorized in his youth. Technology had advanced, social structures had evolved, and the criminal landscape had transformed in ways that made his old methodologies seem almost quaint by comparison. But if the authorities thought that age and changed circumstances would somehow domesticate Pedro Rodriguez Filho, they were about to learn a horrifying lesson about the permanence of certain kinds of evil. Within months of his release, bodies began appearing with disturbingly familiar characteristics: the precise wounds, the methodical torture, the symbolic arrangements that served as Pedro's signature calling cards. The killings weren't as frequent as they had been in his youth, but they were arguably more terrifying in their calculated precision. Decades of imprisonment had refined Pedro's skills rather than dulled them. He had spent 30 years studying, planning, and perfecting his craft within the controlled environment of prison. Now, with unlimited access to potential victims and the hard-earned wisdom of experience, he was operating at a level of efficiency that made his earlier work seem crude by comparison. He had spent his first months of freedom conducting surveillance, not just of potential victims but of law enforcement techniques, learning how investigative methods had advanced during his incarceration and adapting his own methods accordingly. This wasn't the impulsive young killer of his early years, but a mature predator operating with decades of experience and intimate knowledge of how the justice system functioned. As his post-prison body count began to climb, Pedro also embarked on what could only be described as a public relations campaign designed to justify and legitimize his actions. He granted interviews to journalists, appeared on television programs, and even participated in documentary projects that portrayed him not as a serial killer but as a vigilante hero cleaning up society's refuse. These media appearances were masterclasses in manipulation, showcasing Pedro's ability to present his murders as necessary social services rather than criminal acts. He spoke eloquently about his victims' crimes, providing detailed evidence of their transgressions and explaining how their deaths had made Brazilian society safer. Pedro's campaign against this man lasted nearly a year and included elaborate schemes designed to expose the judge's corruption while simultaneously destroying his peace of mind. Evidence of the judge's crimes began appearing in impossible locations: inside his locked car, tucked into his morning newspaper, slipped under his office door despite round-the-clock security. The psychological pressure was accompanied by increasingly direct threats that demonstrated Pedro's intimate knowledge of the judge's daily routine, family members, and personal vulnerabilities. The judge attempted to seek police protection, but Pedro's reputation and the evidence of corruption he had compiled made authorities reluctant to provide assistance to someone who had clearly violated his oath of office. When Pedro finally struck, the judge was found in his chambers arranged in a tableau that told the story of his corruption in grotesque detail. Legal briefs describing his crimes were arranged around the body. Evidence of his illegal activities was displayed like an art exhibition, and the wounds inflicted on his corpse corresponded directly to the number of innocent people who had suffered due to his corrupt verdicts. The killing sent shockwaves through Brazil's judicial system, as other potentially corrupt officials suddenly found themselves reconsidering their own activities. Pedro had demonstrated that no position was too high, no security too tight, no protection too comprehensive to shield someone from his reach if they violated his moral code. But even the most successful predators eventually face their own mortality, and Pedro's final chapter was approaching with the inexorable certainty of karma finally balancing the scales of justice. The end came in 2023, in circumstances that seemed almost poetically appropriate for a man who had lived by violence for 7 decades. Pedro was found dead in his apartment, the victim of unknown assailants who had apparently decided that Brazil's most notorious killer had finally outlived his usefulness or perhaps crossed the wrong people. The irony was not lost on those who had followed Pedro's career that he met his end the same way he had dispatched so many others, suddenly, violently, and without the opportunity for final words or pleas for mercy. The man who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner for over 100 victims had finally faced his own judgment day. The investigation into Pedro's murder revealed a complexity that mirrored his own career. Multiple suspects emerged, ranging from family members of his victims seeking long-delayed revenge to rival criminals who saw his death as necessary for their own survival. The case remained unsolved, perhaps appropriately, as if the universe had decided that some questions were better left unanswered. Pedro Rodriguez Filho's death marked the end of one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in modern history. Over the course of 69 years, he had killed more than 100 people, spent 34 years in prison, and somehow managed to die in his own bed rather than in a jail cell or electric chair. His legacy was a complicated mixture of horror and fascination, revulsion and admiration, that reflected the moral ambiguity of a world where traditional justice systems had failed so completely that vigilante killers could be viewed as heroes. The monster was finally dead, but the questions he had raised about justice, morality, and the nature of evil would continue to haunt Brazilian society long after his corpse had been laid to rest. In death, as in life, Pedro Rodriguez Filho remained exactly what he had always been: a disturbing mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of human nature and the society that had created him. His story serves as a chilling reminder that monsters are not born in isolation but are forged in the crucible of human cruelty, shaped by circumstances that transform victims into victimizers and create predators whose appetites can never be satisfied. Pedro's legacy is written in blood across the pages of Brazilian criminal history, a testament to what happens when the line between justice and vengeance disappears entirely. The Devil's Ledger was finally closed, but the names written within its pages would never be forgotten. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Tower Maniac, a story of terror beneath the power lines. Beneath the humming electrical towers that pierce the Brazilian sky like metallic vultures, a predator stalked the streets of Moringa. For 10 years, Rony's Fawn Firmino Gomez transformed the industrial landscape into his personal graveyard, leaving a trail of terror that would earn him one of the most chilling monikers in Brazilian criminal history, the Tower Maniac. His victims, vulnerable women whose lives had already been marked by society's cruelest edges, would meet their end in the shadows of these towering sentinels, their bodies discarded like broken dolls beneath the very structures that powered a city. This is the story of how one man's darkness plunged an entire community into a nightmare that lasted a decade, and how the electric towers that once symbolized progress became monuments to unspeakable horror. The year 2005 marked the beginning of what would become one of Brazil's most haunting serial murder cases. Moringa, a sprawling city in the state of Parana, seemed like an unlikely stage for such brutality. With its tree-lined streets and modern infrastructure, it projected an image of prosperity and safety. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something sinister was taking root, something that would eventually grow into a terror that defied comprehension. Roni's Fan Firmino Gomez was not the monster one might expect from horror films. Standing at average height with unremarkable features, he possessed the kind of face that dissolved into crowds, forgotten moments after being seen. This anonymity would become his greatest weapon, allowing him to move through the city like a ghost, selecting his victims with calculated precision while remaining invisible to those who might have stopped him. The electrical towers that dominated Maringa's landscape served a dual purpose in the city's design. These steel giants, stretching their arms across the horizon like mechanical scarecrows, carried the lifeblood of modern civilization, electricity that powered homes, businesses, and dreams. But for Gomez, these structures represented something far more sinister. They became his calling cards, his signature, his grotesque art installations where human life was reduced to discarded waste. Understanding the mind of Roni's Gomez requires delving into the psychology of a predator who viewed human beings as disposable objects. His victims were not random selections but carefully chosen targets. Women whose circumstances made them vulnerable, whose disappearances might not immediately trigger massive manhunts. These were women working in prostitution, already marginalized by society, making them perfect prey for a killer who understood that the invisible are often the most easily victimized. The first murder attributed to Gomez occurred in late 2005, though investigators would later suspect his activities may have begun earlier. The victim was discovered beneath one of the city's many electrical towers, her body positioned in a way that suggested both contempt and ritual. The scene was disturbing beyond imagination, not just for the brutality inflicted upon the victim, but for the cold calculation evident in every detail. What made these crimes particularly terrifying was not just their savagery, but their methodical nature. Each murder site was chosen with care, always beneath the towering electrical structures that gave Gomez his infamous nickname. These locations were typically isolated, far from main roads and residential areas, places where screams would go unheard and where a killer could work without interruption. The towers themselves seemed to watch over these scenes of horror, their cables humming with electricity while below, human life was extinguished with mechanical precision. The positioning of the bodies revealed a disturbing pattern that would become Gomez's signature. His victims were not simply killed and abandoned. They were arranged, displayed almost, as if their deaths were performances meant to communicate something to those who would discover them. This theatrical element suggested a killer who took pride in his work, who viewed each murder not as a crime of passion but as a carefully orchestrated event. Local authorities initially struggled to connect these early murders to a single perpetrator. The victims' lifestyles made investigation challenging, as they often operated outside conventional social networks. Many had no fixed addresses, few close relationships, and their movements were difficult to track. This isolation, which made them vulnerable to Gomez's predations, also made it harder for investigators to piece together the timeline of his activities. The psychological profile that began to emerge painted a picture of a man driven by more than simple bloodlust. Gomez appeared to be motivated by a complex mixture of hatred, control, and a desire to create lasting monuments to his power over life and death. The electrical towers served as more than just convenient dumping grounds. They were integral to his twisted vision, transforming utilitarian infrastructure into symbols of death and domination. As 2005 drew to a close, the people of Moringa remained largely unaware that a monster had begun hunting in their midst. The victims' marginalized status meant their deaths received limited media attention, and the pattern that would eventually expose Gomez's systematic approach had not yet become clear to investigators. But beneath the electrical towers, in the shadows cast by those steel monuments to progress, terror was taking root, spreading its poison through the community like a malignant tumor. The early murders established what would become Gomez's methodology: a careful selection of vulnerable victims, isolated locations beneath electrical towers, and a level of brutality that spoke to deep-seated psychological disorders. Each crime scene told a story of power, control, and contempt for human life, written in violence and sealed with death. What perhaps made these early crimes most chilling was their efficiency. Gomez displayed an understanding of forensic science that suggested either extensive research or previous experience with violence. His ability to avoid leaving conclusive evidence at crime scenes indicated a level of planning and preparation that elevated his crimes from opportunistic violence to calculated terrorism. The electrical towers of Moringa, once symbols of progress and connectivity, began their transformation into something far more sinister. Each humming cable, each steel beam reaching toward the sky, would eventually become associated with the darkest chapter in the city's history. The infrastructure designed to bring light to the community had become the backdrop for its greatest darkness. As investigators began to recognize patterns in these early crimes, they faced the daunting reality that they were dealing with an adversary who combined intelligence with brutality, organization with madness. The Tower Maniac had announced his presence to the world, marking his territory beneath the electrical infrastructure of Moringa with violence that defied comprehension. The stage was set for a decade of terror that would transform a modern Brazilian city into a hunting ground where the most vulnerable members of society would pay the ultimate price for one man's twisted fantasies. The electrical towers stood sentinel over this emerging nightmare, their shadows growing longer as the darkness spread, promising more horror to come. The years 2006 through 2010 marked the peak of Gomez's murderous campaign, a period during which his methodical approach to killing evolved into a sophisticated system of predation. Each murder built upon the lessons learned from previous crimes, creating an escalating spiral of violence that terrorized the most vulnerable members of Moringa's society while simultaneously challenging law enforcement's ability to protect and serve. During this period, the electrical towers of Moringa became synonymous with death. These skeletal structures, originally constructed to bring power and progress to the region, were systematically transformed into monuments of horror. Gomez's selection of these locations was not random but represented a calculated psychological strategy designed to maximize the impact of his crimes while minimizing his chances of capture. The killer's methodology during these peak years revealed a disturbing evolution in both technique and savagery. His early crimes, while brutal, paled in comparison to the systematic torture and degradation that characterized his later attacks. It became clear that Gomez was not content with simple murder. He required suffering, fear, and the complete domination of his victims before granting them the release of death. Witness accounts from this period, though fragmented due to the victim's marginalized status, painted a picture of a predator who had perfected his approach to hunting. Gomez developed an understanding of the schedules, habits, and vulnerabilities of women working in prostitution. He knew where they congregated, when they were most isolated, and how to approach them without triggering immediate alarm. The psychological torture that preceded each murder became increasingly elaborate during this period. Gomez appeared to derive sadistic pleasure from the terror he instilled in his victims, prolonging their suffering in ways that demonstrated not just cruelty but a methodical approach to inflicting maximum psychological trauma. The crime scenes from this era told stories of prolonged agony that challenged even experienced investigators' ability to maintain professional detachment. One particularly disturbing aspect of Gomez's activities during this period was his apparent ability to study and learn from law enforcement responses to his crimes. Each subsequent murder showed evidence that he had analyzed police procedures, media coverage, and investigative techniques, adapting his methods to stay ahead of those hunting him. This cat-and-mouse game elevated his crimes from random acts of violence to a systematic campaign of terror directed not just at his immediate victims but at the broader community. The electrical towers themselves became integral to his psychological warfare. Gomez seemed to understand that these structures held particular significance for the community. They represented progress, connectivity, and the power that drove modern life. By defiling these symbols with his crimes, he was not just killing individuals but attacking the very concept of safety and order that civilized society depends upon. During the height of his activities, Gomez's crimes took on an almost ritualistic quality. The positioning of bodies, the timing of discoveries, and the selection of specific towers all suggested a killer who had moved beyond simple murder into the realm of symbolic terrorism. Each crime scene was a message, a declaration that nowhere was safe, that the infrastructure society depended upon could be turned against it. The investigation during this period faced numerous challenges that Gomez seemed to anticipate and exploit. The marginalized status of his victims meant that their disappearances often went unreported for days or weeks, giving him time to cover his tracks and plan subsequent attacks. When bodies were discovered, they were often in advanced states of decomposition, making forensic analysis difficult and reducing the likelihood of recovering usable evidence. Local media coverage during these peak years began to reflect the growing awareness that Moringa was facing something unprecedented. The electrical towers, once barely noticed background elements of the urban landscape, became focal points of community anxiety. Parents warned children to stay away from these structures, and adults found themselves looking at the familiar skyline with new eyes, seeing potential danger where they had once seen only progress. The impact on the community extended far beyond the immediate circle of potential victims. The knowledge that a predator was systematically hunting beneath the electrical towers created a pervasive sense of unease that affected everyone. The infrastructure that powered daily life became a constant reminder that evil could lurk in the most familiar places. Gomez's ability to evade capture during this period spoke to either exceptional luck or sophisticated planning. Crime scenes were processed meticulously, yet he managed to avoid leaving conclusive evidence that could lead to his identification. This success emboldened him, leading to increasingly frequent attacks and more elaborate displays of violence. The psychological profile of Gomez that emerged during this period revealed a killer who had moved beyond crimes of opportunity into the realm of organized, systematic predation. His attacks showed evidence of extensive planning, from victim selection to crime scene preparation. He had developed what could only be described as a professional approach to murder, treating each killing as a project to be executed with precision and care. The electrical towers of Moringa began to take on an almost supernatural quality in the community's collective consciousness. These structures, which had once represented human achievement and progress, became symbols of vulnerability and terror. The humming of electrical cables, once barely noticed, became an ominous soundtrack to daily life for those living near these installations. As the body count rose and the pattern became undeniable, law enforcement resources were increasingly focused on the Tower Maniac investigation. Special task forces were assembled, forensic experts were consulted, and new investigative techniques were employed. Yet Gomez continued to stay one step ahead, adapting his methods to counter each new approach taken by his pursuers. The reign of terror that characterized this period of Gomez's activities represents one of the darkest chapters in Brazilian criminal history. The systematic nature of his crimes, combined with his ability to evade capture while escalating the violence and frequency of his attacks, created a perfect storm of horror that would leave permanent scars on the community of Moringa and forever change how people viewed the electrical infrastructure that powered their daily lives. The period from 2011 to 2014 witnessed a dramatic escalation in both the frequency and brutality of Gomez's crimes, while simultaneously marking the beginning of the end of his reign of terror. Law enforcement agencies, initially hampered by the marginalized status of the victims and the killer's sophisticated methods, began to develop new strategies and technologies that would eventually lead to his downfall. During these crucial years, Gomez's psychological deterioration became increasingly evident in his crime scenes. What had previously been methodical murders evolved into frenzied displays of violence that suggested a killer losing control of his carefully maintained facade. The electrical towers beneath which he operated became theaters for increasingly elaborate and disturbing tableaus of death, each more horrifying than the last. The breakthrough in the investigation came through a combination of technological advancement and old-fashioned detective work. Security cameras, becoming more prevalent throughout Moringa during this period, began to capture fragments of Gomez's movements. While no single recording provided definitive identification, the accumulation of partial images began to create a pattern that investigators could follow. One of the most significant developments during this period was the establishment of a dedicated task force focused exclusively on the Tower Maniac case. This specialized unit brought together expertise from multiple disciplines, including criminal psychology, forensic science, and behavioral analysis. Their coordinated approach marked a turning point in the investigation, transforming it from a reactive response to individual crimes into a proactive hunt for a serial predator. The task force's psychological profile of Gomez revealed disturbing insights into his methodology and motivation. Analysis of crime scenes indicated that his attacks were becoming increasingly personal and vicious, suggesting that the killer was no longer satisfied with simple murder, but required ever greater levels of violence to achieve psychological satisfaction. This escalation created opportunities for investigators, as more violent crimes often leave more forensic evidence. During this period, Gomez's selection of victims began to show signs of deteriorating judgment. While his earlier targets had been carefully chosen for their vulnerability and the likelihood that their disappearances would go unnoticed, his later victims included women with stronger social connections and more regular contact with family members. These disappearances triggered faster police responses and more intensive investigations. The electrical towers themselves became crucial elements in the investigation strategy. Authorities began systematic surveillance of these structures, recognizing that Gomez's psychological attachment to these locations represented both his signature and his potential weakness. The installation of motion sensors and cameras near key tower installations created a network of electronic eyes watching for suspicious activity. One particularly horrifying discovery during this period involved the revelation that Gomez had been returning to previous crime sites. Evidence suggested that he revisited the locations where he had disposed of earlier victims, possibly to relive the crimes or to ensure that evidence had not been overlooked. This pattern provided investigators with opportunities to potentially catch him in the act of returning to familiar territory. The forensic analysis of crime scenes from this period revealed increasingly sophisticated methods of evidence destruction and concealment. Gomez appeared to be learning from each investigation, adapting his techniques to counter new forensic technologies and investigative approaches. This evolution demonstrated a level of intelligence and adaptability that made him particularly dangerous and difficult to catch. Community involvement became a crucial factor in the investigation during these years. As awareness of the Tower Maniac's activities spread, citizens began to report suspicious activities near electrical installations. While most of these reports proved false alarms, the increased vigilance created additional pressure on Gomez and limited his ability to operate with complete impunity. The psychological impact of Gomez's crimes on the community reached its peak during this period. The electrical towers, once barely noticed elements of the urban landscape, became focal points of terror and anxiety. Real estate values near these installations plummeted as residents sought to distance themselves from structures associated with such horror. The city's infrastructure, designed to improve quality of life, had become a source of constant fear. Media coverage of the Tower Maniac case intensified during these years, bringing national and international attention to Maringuez's nightmare. This increased scrutiny brought additional resources to the investigation but also created pressure for quick results. The balancing act between keeping the public informed and maintaining investigative security became increasingly challenging for law enforcement. The killer's escalating violence during this period included new forms of torture and degradation that suggested a complete loss of humanity. Crime scenes became increasingly elaborate displays of sadism that challenged even experienced investigators' ability to maintain professional objectivity. The level of brutality indicated that Gomez had moved beyond killing for psychological satisfaction into a realm of pure evil that defied rational explanation. Technological advances in DNA analysis during this period provided new opportunities for investigators to link crimes definitively to a single perpetrator. Improved extraction techniques and more sensitive testing methods allowed forensic scientists to develop profiles from degraded samples that would have been useless in earlier investigations. This technological progress created new hope for breakthrough developments in the case. The investigation's focus on Gomez's probable residence and work patterns began to narrow the search area significantly. Analysis of crime locations, timing, and logistics suggested that the killer lived or worked within a specific geographic area. This geographic profiling allowed authorities to concentrate their resources and surveillance efforts on the most likely zones of operation. During the later part of this period, investigators began to develop theories about Gomez's possible employment or regular activities that would give him knowledge of electrical infrastructure and access to remote locations. This focus on individuals with technical knowledge or employment related to power systems provided a new avenue for investigation that would prove crucial to his eventual identification. The web that had been slowly tightening around the Tower Maniac throughout these years was beginning to close. Multiple lines of investigation were converging, technological advances were providing new tools for analysis, and increased community awareness was limiting his operational freedom. The stage was being set for the final confrontation between predator and prey, with the electrical towers of Moringa serving as silent witnesses to the approaching climax of one of Brazil's most notorious criminal cases. The year 2015 marked the culmination of a decade-long nightmare that had terrorized Moringa and transformed its electrical infrastructure into symbols of fear and death. The methodical investigation that had been building momentum over the previous years finally converged on Rony's Fon Firmino Gomes, bringing an end to one of Brazil's most disturbing serial murder cases and delivering long-overdue justice for his victims. The breakthrough that led to Gomes' identification came through a combination of advanced forensic technology and persistent detective work. DNA evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes, previously too degraded for analysis, yielded usable profiles through improved extraction techniques. When cross-referenced with expanded databases and new genetic genealogy methods, these profiles began to point toward a specific individual whose movements and background aligned with the established pattern of the Tower Maniac's activities. Surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras, painstakingly reviewed and enhanced using new digital analysis techniques, provided crucial visual confirmation of suspect movements. While individual recordings had been insufficient to provide identification, the accumulated evidence created a timeline that placed Gomes in the vicinity of multiple crime scenes at times consistent with the estimated murder windows. The arrest of Rony Gomes on charges related to the Tower Maniac murders sent shockwaves through Moringa and captured national attention. The unremarkable appearance of the man responsible for such systematic horror challenged public expectations of what a serial killer should look like, reinforcing the terrifying reality that monsters often hide behind ordinary facades. During interrogation, Gomes initially maintained his innocence, but the overwhelming forensic evidence gradually broke down his defenses. Investigators revealed that they had connected him definitively to at least 6 murders, though they suspected his actual victim count might be higher. The methodical nature of the crimes and the extended period over which they occurred suggested a level of systematic predation that defied comprehension. The psychological evaluation of Gomes revealed a complex individual whose outward normalcy masked profound psychological disorders. Mental health professionals identified antisocial personality traits, sadistic tendencies, and a complete lack of empathy for his victims. His ability to function normally in social and professional settings while simultaneously conducting a campaign of systematic murder demonstrated the sophisticated nature of his psychological compartmentalization. Details that emerged during the investigation painted a horrifying picture of Gomes' methodology and the suffering he inflicted upon his victims. Evidence suggested that many of the women were held captive for extended periods before being murdered, during which time they endured psychological and physical torture that exceeded the boundaries of human decency. The electrical towers where their bodies were eventually discovered represented only the final chapter of prolonged ordeals that began when they first encountered their killer. The trial of Rony Gomes became a media sensation, drawing attention from across Brazil and internationally. Prosecutors presented evidence of systematic predation that spanned a decade, painting a picture of a killer who had refined his methods over time while escalating the brutality of his attacks. The courtroom testimony included graphic details of crime scenes and forensic evidence that challenged even legal professionals' ability to maintain composure. Family members and friends of the victims, many of whom had lived with uncertainty about their loved ones' fates for years, finally received closure through the judicial process. The trial provided a platform for these marginalized voices to be heard, honoring the memory of women whose lives had been cut short by unimaginable violence. Their testimony humanized the statistics, reminding the world that behind each crime scene was a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who cared about them. The defense's attempts to mitigate Gomes' culpability through claims of mental illness were ultimately unsuccessful in the face of overwhelming evidence of premeditation and calculation. The systematic nature of his crimes, combined with his ability to evade capture for a decade while escalating his activities, demonstrated a level of organization inconsistent with claims of diminished capacity. The sentencing of Gomes to 21 years imprisonment marked the official end of the Tower Maniac's reign of terror, though many observers felt that the punishment was insufficient given the scope and brutality of his crimes. The Brazilian justice system's limitations in dealing with serial killers became a subject of public debate, with many calling for reforms to ensure that such predators could never again threaten innocent lives. The The impact of Gomez's crimes on Moringa extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The electrical towers that had served as his signature became permanent reminders of the horror that had stalked the city for a decade. Many of these structures were eventually relocated or modified in an attempt to help the community heal from the trauma associated with these locations. The investigation itself became a case study in law enforcement adaptation and technological advancement. The techniques developed and refined during the pursuit of the tower maniac influenced criminal investigation methods throughout Brazil and beyond. The case demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation, technological innovation, and persistent detective work in confronting sophisticated serial predators. Mental health professionals and criminologists continue to study the case of Ronis Gomez for insights into the psychology of serial killers and the societal factors that enable such individuals to operate undetected for extended periods. His crimes highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the importance of ensuring that all members of society receive equal protection under the law. The electrical towers of Moringa, once symbols of progress and connectivity, slowly began to reclaim their original meaning as the community worked to heal from its collective trauma. Memorial services for the victims helped transform these structures from monuments to horror into symbols of remembrance and resilience. The city's recovery process demonstrated the human capacity to overcome even the most profound darkness and rebuild meaning from the ashes of tragedy. The legacy of the Tower Maniac case serves as a reminder of the evil that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary society and the importance of vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable members of our communities. The steel giants that once sheltered a predator now stand as silent sentinels, watching over a city that has learned to recognize the shadows and refuse to let such darkness take root again. As Ronis Firmino Gomez began serving his sentence, the electrical towers of Moringa hummed once again with the power of progress rather than the echoes of terror. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served beneath the steel structures that had witnessed both humanity's capacity for evil and its ultimate triumph over darkness. The Tower Maniac's reign had ended, but the lessons learned from his decade of terror would endure, serving as a guardian against future horrors and a testament to the resilience of communities that refuse to be broken by evil. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Prince George Predator. Beneath the towering pines of northern British Columbia, where shadows stretch like gnarled fingers across forgotten trails, a predator stalked his prey with methodical precision. Between 1981 and 1982, the city of Prince George became a hunting ground for Edward Dennis Isaac, a man whose very name would become synonymous with terror. 3 innocent women would fall victim to his calculated brutality, their bodies discarded like broken dolls in the wilderness that surrounded their once peaceful community. This is not merely a story of murder. It is a chilling examination of evil incarnate, a descent into the darkest corners of human depravity where mercy dies and monsters are born. What drove a man to commit such unspeakable acts? How did he select his victims? And what finally brought his reign of terror to an end? Prepare yourself for a journey into the abyss, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the capacity for human evil. The year 1981 dawned cold and unforgiving in Prince George, British Columbia. Snow-laden branches creaked ominously in the bitter wind, while the city's 70,000 residents went about their daily routines, blissfully unaware that death had taken residence among them. In the shadowy recesses of this northern community, Edward Dennis Isaac was undergoing a transformation, one that would soon paint the pristine wilderness crimson with innocent blood. To understand the magnitude of horror that was about to unfold, one must first comprehend the geography of fear that Isaac would exploit. Prince George sat like a vulnerable island surrounded by an ocean of dense forest, where towering spruce and pine trees created a labyrinth of hiding places. Miles upon miles of logging roads snaked through this wilderness, leading to remote clearings where screams would never be heard and bodies could lie undiscovered for months, even years. Isaac was not born a killer. Monsters rarely announce themselves so obviously. He was a man who had learned to wear the mask of normalcy with disturbing proficiency. To his neighbors, he appeared unremarkable. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd without leaving so much as a ripple in memory. But behind those seemingly ordinary eyes burned something far more sinister. A predatory intelligence that was beginning to awaken from its dormant state. The psychological transformation that occurs within a serial killer often follows a predictable pattern, yet Isaac's evolution seemed to accelerate with terrifying speed. Where most killers experience a gradual escalation, Isaac appeared to possess an innate understanding of violence, as if the art of murder was encoded within his very DNA. His fantasies, which had likely simmered beneath the surface for years, were now demanding physical manifestation. The first signs of his developing pathology became evident in his increasing isolation and his obsessive study of the wilderness surrounding Prince George. He would spend hours driving the logging roads, mapping every turnoff, every secluded clearing, every spot where a person could be taken without witnesses. These reconnaissance missions were not random. They were the methodical preparations of a predator who understood that successful hunting required intimate knowledge of the terrain. Isaac's victim selection process revealed a chilling level of calculation. He didn't hunt impulsively. Instead, he observed, studied, and waited. His targets were invariably women who found themselves vulnerable, those who worked late shifts, lived alone, or frequently traveled the same routes. He understood that predictability was weakness, and weakness could be exploited. The psychological profile of Isaac begins to emerge when examining his modus operandi. Unlike disorganized killers who strike in frenzied, impulsive attacks, Isaac displayed the hallmarks of an organized predator. He planned meticulously, prepared thoroughly, and executed with cold precision. This level of organization suggested not just intelligence, but a deep-seated need for control over his victims, control over the narrative, and ultimately control over life and death itself. The city of Prince George, with its transient population of loggers, miners, and seasonal workers, provided the perfect hunting ground for someone like Isaac. People came and went with such frequency that missing persons might not be reported immediately. The harsh northern climate meant that outdoor activities were limited, creating predictable patterns of movement that a patient predator could exploit. As winter melted into spring in 1981, Isaac's fantasies were no longer sufficient to satiate his growing hunger for violence. The careful observer, the one who had spent months studying the terrain and the prey, was ready to become the hunter. The psychological barrier that separates fantasy from reality was about to be shattered forever. The transformation from fantasy to action rarely occurs overnight, but when it does, the results are often catastrophic. Isaac had crossed that invisible line, and there would be no returning to the mundane existence he had previously inhabited. The monster within had fully awakened, and it demanded to be fed. His first victim would not be chosen at random. Like a spider selecting the perfect location for its web, Isaac had identified the ideal hunting ground, a place where vulnerability intersected with opportunity, where screams would be swallowed by the wilderness, and where evidence could be buried beneath layers of pine needles and forest debris. The meticulous nature of Isaac's preparation extended beyond simple geography. He had studied the routines of law enforcement in Prince George, understanding their patrol patterns, response times, and the jurisdictional boundaries that might complicate an investigation. This level of preparation suggested a criminal intelligence that was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing. As the days grew longer and the snow began its gradual retreat, Edward Dennis Isaac was putting the final touches on a plan that would terrorize a community and destroy multiple families. The stage was set, the hunting ground prepared, and the predator was ready to strike. What happened next would forever change Prince George from a quiet northern city into a place where parents locked their doors twice and women traveled in groups after dark. The monster had awakened, and its hunger was insatiable. The first kill was approaching, not as an act of impulse or passion, but as the calculated execution of a plan that had been months in the making. Isaac understood that once he crossed this final threshold, there would be no turning back. The man he had been would die with his first victim, replaced entirely by the predator he was destined to become. In the gathering twilight of that fateful spring evening, as shadows lengthened across the city like reaching fingers of death, Edward Dennis Isaac began his hunt. The forest waited in silent anticipation, ready to receive its first offering in what would become a ritual of unspeakable horror. The awakening was complete. The monster had been born. The attack came without warning, swift and brutal as a winter storm descending upon the unsuspecting landscape. Isaac's first victim, whose identity remains forever etched in the annals of Prince George's darkest chapter, had no idea that her final moments of freedom were ticking away like grains of sand through an hourglass of horror. She was young, vibrant, with dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of the northern city she called home. Working an evening shift at a local establishment, she had developed the routine that Isaac had so patiently observed, a routine that would ultimately seal her fate. The predator had noted every detail: the time she finished work, the route she took home, the lonely stretch of road where streetlights flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness. The methodology Isaac employed in his first kill revealed the terrifying depth of his preparation. This was not the work of an opportunistic criminal striking in a moment of passion. This was surgical precision applied to the art of murder. He had selected his location with the calculated care of a general choosing a battlefield, a secluded area along her route home where tree lines provided cover and the nearest house was miles away. The initial approach was likely deceptive, designed to lower his victim's guard. Isaac understood the psychology of predation better than most trained killers. His unremarkable appearance served as the perfect camouflage, allowing him to get close enough to strike before his victim realized the mortal danger she faced. Perhaps he feigned car trouble or offered assistance with some manufactured emergency. The exact ruse matters less than its effectiveness. What followed was a display of violence so calculated and systematic that it revealed Isaac's true nature with horrifying clarity. This was not a crime of passion, but an execution carried out with methodical precision. The victim's final moments would have been filled with incomprehensible terror as she realized that the seemingly helpful stranger had transformed into something monstrous. Isaac's choice to transport his victim to a secondary location demonstrated both his organizational skills and his sadistic nature. The kill site he had selected was far from prying eyes, deep within the forest where his victim's screams would be absorbed by the towering pines. This isolated location served multiple purposes. It provided him with the time and privacy to indulge his violent fantasies, while also complicating any future investigation. The brutality inflicted upon his first victim set a template that Isaac would follow with horrifying consistency. The violence was not merely functional, it was expressive. Each wound, each act of degradation, each moment of prolonged suffering served to feed the monster's insatiable appetite for control and domination. The victim became not just a casualty, but a canvas upon which Isaac painted his twisted psychological needs. The disposal of the body revealed perhaps the most chilling aspect of Isaac's methodology. Rather than attempting to hide his crime completely, he positioned the remains in a manner that suggested both contempt for his victim and confidence in his ability to evade capture. The body was left in a wooded area where it would eventually be discovered, but not before the elements and wildlife had obscured crucial evidence. This calculated disposal served multiple psychological needs for Isaac. It allowed him to revisit the scene of his crime, to relive the moments of absolute power he had exercised over another human being. The knowledge that discovery was inevitable added an element of psychological terrorism to his crime, not just against his victim, but against the entire community that would eventually learn of her fate. The investigation that followed the discovery of Isaac's first victim revealed the inadequacies of rural law enforcement when confronted with such sophisticated criminal behavior. The crime scene had been compromised by weather and wildlife, crucial evidence had been destroyed or scattered, and the sheer remoteness of the location made thorough forensic examination nearly impossible. Detective work in such cases relies heavily on witness statements, but Isaac had chosen his hunting ground specifically to avoid witnesses. The victim had simply vanished from her normal routine, reappearing days or weeks later as a corpse in the wilderness. The gap between disappearance and discovery provided Isaac with precious time to distance himself from the crime and destroy any evidence that might link him to his victim. The The psychological impact of Isaac's first kill rippled through Prince George like shock waves from an earthquake. Women who had previously felt secure walking alone began traveling in groups. Evening shifts became positions that no one wanted to fill. The community's collective sense of safety had been shattered by the realization that a predator was moving among them. For Isaac himself, the completion of his first murder marked a point of no return. The psychological barriers that had once restrained his violent impulses had been permanently destroyed. The kill had not satisfied his hunger. Instead, it had only served to whet his appetite for more. The interval between his first victim and his second would be significantly shorter, as the predator's confidence grew along with his skill. The forensic examination of Isaac's first victim, limited though it was by the condition of the remains, provided investigators with crucial insights into the killer's methodology. The patterns of violence suggested someone with significant physical strength and a deep knowledge of human anatomy. The precision of certain wounds indicated that this was not Isaac's first experience with violence, even if it was his first murder. Most disturbing of all was the evidence of prolonged captivity before death. Isaac had not killed quickly. He had taken his time, savoring every moment of his victim's terror and suffering. This revelation transformed the investigation from a simple homicide case into a hunt for a sexual sadist of the most dangerous variety. The community's response to news of the first murder was a mixture of disbelief, horror, and desperate hope that this was an isolated incident. Local officials attempted to reassure residents that increased patrols and heightened awareness would prevent further attacks. These reassurances would prove tragically inadequate against a predator as methodical and intelligent as Edward Dennis Isaac. As investigators worked desperately to identify their killer, Isaac was already planning his next attack. The taste of absolute power, the intoxicating rush of controlling another person's final moments, had become an addiction that demanded regular satisfaction. The monster had been fed, but its hunger had only grown stronger. The first kill was complete, but it was only the beginning of a reign of terror that would claim 2 more innocent lives before justice finally intervened. Edward Dennis Isaac had successfully completed his transformation from man to monster, and Prince George would never be the same. The interval between Isaac's first and second murders was markedly shorter than the years of planning that had preceded his initial kill. The psychological dam had burst, and the flood of violence that followed would overwhelm the small northern community of Prince George. With one successful hunt behind him, Isaac's confidence had swelled to dangerous proportions, and his appetite for killing had evolved from a persistent hunger into an insatiable compulsion. The second victim, like the first, was selected through Isaac's methodical observation process. But now his victim selection had become more sophisticated, more predatory. He no longer needed months of reconnaissance. His experienced eye could identify vulnerability with terrifying efficiency. This woman, too, had routines that made her predictable, habits that transformed her from a person into prey in the mind of a monster who now saw the world through the lens of predation. The evolution of Isaac's modus operandi between his first and second kills revealed the rapid learning curve of an organized killer. Where his first attack had been carefully planned but somewhat crude in execution, his second demonstrated a refinement that chilled investigators to the bone. He had learned from his initial experience, identifying weaknesses in his technique and addressing them with the methodical precision of someone perfecting a craft. The abduction of his second victim occurred with a smoothness that suggested extensive practice. Isaac had identified the perfect convergence of opportunity and isolation, a moment when his chosen prey would be most vulnerable and least likely to receive assistance. The attack itself was swift and overwhelming, designed to incapacitate his victim before she could alert others or mount any effective resistance. Transportation to his killing ground had become more efficient as well. Isaac had refined his understanding of the forest road system, identifying multiple routes to his chosen disposal sites that minimized the risk of detection. He had also improved his timing, ensuring that his movements coincided with periods of minimal traffic and maximum darkness. Every aspect of his crime had been analyzed and optimized. The violence inflicted upon Isaac's second victim was notably more severe than that experienced by his first. This escalation was not simply the result of growing confidence. It reflected the killer's increasing need for stimulation. Like an addict requiring ever larger doses to achieve the same high, Isaac's psychological dependence on violence was demanding more extreme expressions of brutality. The secondary crime scene where Isaac tortured and murdered his second victim had been prepared with even greater care than the first. He had identified a location that was not only isolated but also provided him with extended privacy to indulge his sadistic impulses. The evidence suggested that this victim had been held captive for an extended period, subjected to prolonged torture before finally being granted the release of death. The disposal of the second body demonstrated Isaac's growing sophistication as a killer. Rather than simply abandoning the remains, he had taken steps to delay discovery while ensuring that the body would eventually be found. This calculated approach served his psychological needs. He wanted the community to know of his work, to understand that a predator was operating among them, but he also wanted to maintain enough secrecy to continue his killing spree. The discovery of Isaac's second victim sent shock waves through Prince George that dwarfed the community's reaction to the first murder. The realization that they were dealing with a serial killer rather than a single tragic incident transformed the investigation from a local matter into a priority case that attracted resources from across the province. The RCMP established a task force specifically dedicated to hunting down the killer who was terrorizing their community. Forensic examination of the second crime scene provided investigators with additional insights into their quarry's psychology and methodology. The killer demonstrated a level of organization that placed him firmly in the category of sophisticated predators. He planned carefully, executed methodically, and had clearly studied techniques for avoiding detection. This was not someone who could be caught through traditional investigative methods. The patterns emerging from Isaac's crimes painted a disturbing portrait of a killer who was not only highly intelligent, but also possessed an intuitive understanding of criminal investigation. He avoided leaving fingerprints, disposed of evidence that might provide DNA samples, and selected killing grounds that made thorough forensic examination nearly impossible. Every action suggested someone with either extensive criminal experience or a deep understanding of police procedure. The psychological profile developed by investigators described a killer who was likely living a relatively normal life within the community. His ability to select victims and execute crimes without detection suggested someone who possessed excellent social camouflage. He could interact with potential victims, witnesses, and even law enforcement officers without arousing suspicion. This realization was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire investigation. As the investigation intensified, Isaac was already stalking his third victim. The success of his first two kills had not satiated his appetite. Instead, it had only served to refine his technique and increase his confidence. He moved through the community like a ghost, observing, selecting, and preparing for his next attack, while investigators struggled to identify even the most basic characteristics of their quarry. The third victim, unaware of the death sentence that had already been passed upon her, continued her normal routine while Isaac shadowed her movements. He had identified her through the same methodical observation process that had doomed her predecessors, noting her habits, her schedule, and most importantly, her vulnerabilities. In his mind, she was no longer a person but simply another opportunity to experience the intoxicating rush of absolute power over life and death. The interval between Isaac's second and third murders was even shorter than the gap between his first two kills. The psychological escalation was accelerating at an alarming rate, suggesting that the killer was losing whatever minimal self-control had previously restrained his violent impulses. The community was running out of time, and investigators were no closer to identifying their suspect than they had been after the first murder. The methodology that Isaac had perfected through his first two kills would reach its most refined form in his third and final murder. Every lesson learned, every technique perfected, every psychological insight gained from his previous crimes would be brought to bear upon his final victim. The monster had reached the pinnacle of his predatory evolution, and the results would be more horrific than anything Prince George had yet experienced. The hunting season was reaching its climax, and Isaac's appetite for killing had grown beyond all rational bounds. The community lived in terror, women traveled in groups, and parents kept their children close. But none of these precautions could protect against a predator as sophisticated and determined as Edward Dennis Isaac. The third kill was approaching, and with it, the most brutal expression yet of a monster's insatiable hunger for human suffering. The third and final murder committed by Edward Dennis Isaac would prove to be both the pinnacle of his predatory evolution and the catalyst for his ultimate downfall. By this point, the killer had refined his methodology to a terrifying level of efficiency, but his growing confidence would soon transform from an asset into a liability that would lead investigators directly to his door. Isaac's final victim represented the culmination of everything he had learned about the art of predation. She was selected through his now-perfected observation techniques, chosen for her predictable routines and exploitable vulnerabilities. But unlike his previous victims, this woman would not simply vanish into the wilderness without a trace. Her murder would provide investigators with the crucial evidence needed to finally unmask the monster who had terrorized their community for over a year. The abduction itself followed Isaac's established pattern, but with subtle variations that reflected his growing boldness. He had become so confident in his abilities that he was willing to take risks that would have been unthinkable during his first kill. This overconfidence would prove to be his undoing, as it led him to make crucial mistakes that would leave an evidence trail pointing directly to his identity. The transportation of his third victim to the killing ground represented the height of Isaac's organizational skills. He had identified a location that was even more isolated than his previous crime scenes, a place where he could indulge his most extreme sadistic impulses without fear of interruption. The site had been prepared in advance, equipped with everything necessary for prolonged torture and eventual murder. The violence inflicted upon Isaac's final victim surpassed even the brutality shown to her predecessors. The escalation was not simply quantitative but qualitative. Isaac had discovered new depths of cruelty, new methods of inflicting both physical and psychological torment. The crime scene would later be described by seasoned investigators as one of the most disturbing they had ever encountered. The torture and murder of his third victim revealed the full extent of Isaac's psychological deterioration. What had begun as calculated violence designed to satisfy specific fantasies had evolved into something far more chaotic and extreme. The killer was no longer simply seeking the rush of power over life and death. He had become addicted to the infliction of suffering itself. The disposal of his final victim's body demonstrated both Isaac's continued sophistication and his growing carelessness. While he still took steps to delay discovery and complicate the investigation, he also left behind evidence that would prove crucial to his eventual identification. A combination of overconfidence and psychological deterioration had finally created cracks in his previously impenetrable facade of careful planning. The discovery of Isaac's third victim galvanized the investigation in ways that the previous murders had not. The escalated violence and the additional evidence found at the scene provided investigators with new leads and a clearer picture of their quarry's psychological profile. The net was beginning to close around Edward Dennis Isaac, though he remained unaware of the danger. Forensic examination of the final crime scene yielded the breakthrough that investigators had been desperately seeking. Physical evidence that had been absent or degraded at the previous scenes was present and analyzable. More importantly, Isaac's growing boldness had led him to spend more time at the scene, increasing his chances of leaving behind trace evidence that could be linked to his identity. The psychological analysis of all three crime scenes painted a comprehensive portrait of a killer whose mental state was deteriorating rapidly. The escalation in violence between murders suggested someone who was losing control of his impulses, while the increasing sophistication of his methods indicated a criminal intelligence that remained dangerously sharp. The combination created a profile of a highly dangerous individual who was becoming increasingly unstable. The investigation that had begun as a desperate search for any clues had evolved into a focused hunt for a specific type of individual. Investigators now knew they were seeking an organized killer with local knowledge, physical strength, access to vehicles, and the social skills necessary to approach victims without immediately arousing suspicion. This profile would prove crucial in narrowing the field of potential suspects. The breakthrough in the case came not through brilliant detective work, but through Isaac's own growing carelessness. A witness who had previously dismissed a seemingly innocent encounter would remember seeing him in the vicinity of his final victim's abduction. This sighting, combined with physical evidence from the crime scene, provided investigators with their first concrete lead in over a year of investigation. The arrest of Edward Dennis Isaac sent shockwaves through Prince George that exceeded even the community's reaction to the discovery of his victims. The revelation that their tormentor had been living among them, interacting with them, perhaps even socializing with them, transformed relief at his capture into a deeper horror at how completely they had been deceived by a monster wearing a human face. Isaac's initial response to his arrest revealed the depth of his psychological detachment from the reality of his crimes. He showed no remorse for his victims, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused, and no recognition of the terror he had inflicted upon an entire community. His primary concern appeared to be the inconvenience of his capture rather than the magnitude of his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed Isaac's arrest provided the community with its first detailed look at the methodology and mindset of the predator who had stalked their streets. The evidence presented during his trial painted a picture of calculated brutality that exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of his crime's severity. The full scope of his sadistic behavior was finally revealed to a horrified public. Isaac's conviction on 3 counts of first-degree murder brought a measure of justice to the families of his victims, but it could never restore what had been lost. 3 young women had died brutal deaths at the hands of a monster, and their families would carry that trauma for the rest of their lives. The community of Prince George had been forever changed by the realization that such evil could exist in their midst. The sentencing of Edward Dennis Isaac to life imprisonment represented not just punishment for his crimes, but also protection for society from a predator who had demonstrated an insatiable appetite for human suffering. The judge's remarks during sentencing acknowledged both the severity of Isaac's crimes and the need to ensure he could never again threaten innocent lives. The aftermath of Isaac's capture and conviction left Prince George grappling with questions that had no satisfactory answers. How had one man's evil gone undetected for so long? What signs had been missed? How many other potential victims had unknowingly escaped death simply through chance or circumstance? These questions would haunt the community for years to come. The case of Edward Dennis Isaac serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for human evil and the vulnerability of innocence when confronted by such calculating brutality. His crimes stripped away the illusion of safety that had previously shielded Prince George from the realization that monsters exist not just in nightmares but in the real world, walking among us, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. The forest roads around Prince George still wind through the same wilderness where Isaac disposed of his victims, but they are now haunted by the memory of unspeakable crimes. The trees that once provided him with cover now stand as silent witnesses to the horror he inflicted, forever marked by their association with one of Canada's most brutal serial killers. Edward Dennis Isaac remains imprisoned, his name forever etched in the annals of criminal history as a reminder of what happens when the thin veneer of civilization fails to contain the monster that lurks within certain individuals. His victims, meanwhile, are remembered not for how they died but for how they lived, as daughters, sisters, friends, and dreams cut short by an evil that defies comprehension. The final hunt had ended, the monster had been caged, but the scars left by his reign of terror would never fully heal. Prince George had learned a terrible lesson about the nature of evil, and that knowledge would forever change how its residents viewed the world around them. In the end, justice had prevailed, but at a cost that could never be fully calculated or repaid. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our 4th story. Story 4, The French Monster, a tale of terror that crossed borders and claimed lives. The blood-soaked snowdrifts of New Hampshire held secrets that would chill the hearts of an entire continent. When the lifeless body of Marietta Ball was discovered on that bitter December morning in 1875, her skull crushed beyond recognition, the authorities had no idea they were staring into the abyss of one man's monstrous legacy. Joseph Loppage, a name that would echo through the annals of North American criminal history like a death knell, had already painted a trail of horror across 2 nations, leaving 4 women dead in his wake. This is the story of a predator who stalked the borderlands between civilization and savagery, a man whose very existence challenged the boundaries of human evil. What drove this French-Canadian drifter to commit acts so heinous that newspapers refused to print the full details? How did one man evade justice for nearly a decade while methodically destroying innocent lives? And why did his reign of terror finally end with the crack of a hangman's rope on a cold New Hampshire morning in 1878? The answers lie buried in a case so disturbing that it forever changed how law enforcement hunted killers across international boundaries. Joseph Loppage entered this world on a frostbitten February morning in 1845, born into the unforgiving wilderness of Quebec's logging territories, where survival meant embracing brutality as a way of life. The Canadian wilderness that cradled his infancy would prove to be a prophetic backdrop for the darkness that would eventually consume him entirely. His childhood unfolded like a gothic nightmare, painted in shades of violence and neglect that would forever stain his soul. The Loppage family existed on the knife's edge of civilization, where the law held no sway and might determined right. Joseph's father, a brutal logger with hands stained by both tree sap and blood, ruled their ramshackle cabin with iron fists and leather straps. The boy learned early that power came from inflicting pain, that weakness invited destruction, and that the screams of the suffering were merely the background music of daily existence. Young Joseph displayed an unsettling fascination with death from his earliest years. Neighbors would later recall finding mutilated animals around the Loppage property. Cats with their eyes gouged out, dogs with their throats methodically slit, birds nailed to fence posts in grotesque displays that seemed to serve no purpose beyond satisfying some twisted hunger lurking within the boy's developing psyche. When confronted about these discoveries, Joseph would simply stare with those cold, dead eyes that would become his most terrifying trademark. The Canadian logging camps where Joseph spent his formative years were breeding grounds for violence and depravity. Men lived like animals, fought like demons, and died like dogs in the muddy streets between the crude wooden structures that served as their temporary homes. It was here that Joseph learned to wield an axe with deadly precision, his young muscles developing the strength that would later crush skulls with horrifying efficiency. By the age of 15, Joseph had already earned a reputation as someone to avoid. His fellow loggers whispered stories of his explosive rages, his tendency to settle disputes with brutal finality, and his disturbing habit of lingering around the bodies of men who died in logging accidents. There was something fundamentally wrong with the way he studied death, the way his eyes would light up when examining broken bones and torn flesh. The first hints of his sexual deviance emerged during his teenage years, manifesting in ways that made even hardened loggers uncomfortable. Joseph would disappear for days at a time, returning with scratches on his face and blood under his fingernails that he could never adequately explain. Local women began reporting encounters with a young man matching his description, encounters that left them bruised, terrified, and reluctant to speak openly about what had transpired in the deep woods where screams carried no further than the nearest trees. His formal education was sporadic at best, but Joseph possessed a cunning intelligence that allowed him to manipulate those around him with frightening effectiveness. He learned to wear masks of charm and respectability when it suited his purposes, though those who looked closely could see the predator lurking just beneath the surface. His ability to shift between personas would later prove instrumental in his capacity to evade capture for so many years. The Catholic Church, which held tremendous influence in Quebec during this period, attempted to intervene in Joseph's development through various priests and missionaries who recognized the dangerous path he was walking. However, their efforts only seemed to fuel his growing hatred for authority and his contempt for the moral structures that governed civilized society. He would later claim that these early religious encounters taught him that hypocrisy was the only true universal truth. As Joseph approached adulthood, the frequency and severity of his violent outbursts escalated dramatically. He was involved in numerous brawls that left opponents permanently maimed, though his ability to present himself as the wrong party often allowed him to escape serious legal consequences. The Canadian authorities of the time were ill-equipped to deal with someone who combined such physical capabilities with such psychological sophistication. The catalyst for his transformation from local troublemaker to interstate killer came in the form of a young woman named Marie Tessier, a baker's daughter from Montreal who made the fatal mistake of spurning his romantic advances during a brief encounter in 1866. Joseph's reaction to this rejection revealed the true depths of his depravity and provided a chilling preview of the horrors yet to come. Marie Tessier was found 3 days after their encounter, her body arranged in a clearing just outside Montreal in a manner so disturbing that the investigating officers struggled to compile a coherent report. Her clothing had been methodically removed and arranged around her corpse in patterns that suggested some form of twisted ritual. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the skull, but the condition of her remains indicated that she had endured hours of torture before death finally claimed her. The investigation into Marie's murder was hampered by the limited forensic techniques of the era and by Joseph's careful attention to covering his tracks. He had already begun developing the methodical approach to violence that would characterize all his future crimes. Every aspect of the attack appeared calculated to maximize both the victim's suffering and his own satisfaction, while minimizing the likelihood of detection. When authorities finally began focusing their suspicions on Joseph, they discovered that he had vanished completely, leaving behind only a few personal possessions and a reputation for violence that suddenly took on new and terrifying significance. Witnesses came forward to describe his final weeks in Quebec, painting a picture of a man whose grip on sanity was rapidly deteriorating and whose conversation had become increasingly focused on themes of death, power, and revenge. The realization that Joseph Loppage had crossed into the United States sent waves of panic through law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. Here was a killer who had demonstrated both the willingness and the ability to hunt human prey, armed with skills honed in the brutal Canadian wilderness and driven by urges that seemed to grow stronger with each act of violence. As 1867 dawned, Joseph Loppage had officially begun his transformation into the creature that would become known as the French Monster. The scared, angry boy from the Quebec logging camps had evolved into something far more dangerous. A predator who had tasted blood and found it intoxicating, a killer who had learned that human life could be snuffed out as easily as the animal lives he had destroyed in his youth. The United States, still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War and struggling to rebuild its social institutions, was ill-prepared for the arrival of such a sophisticated predator. Joseph Loppage was about to embark on a killing spree that would span 2 countries and claim multiple victims, each murder more brutal than the last, each death serving to feed an appetite that grew more insatiable with every life he destroyed. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about hunting killers and protecting innocent lives. Joseph Loppage had found his calling, and the body count was about to begin climbing in earnest. The bustling industrial landscape of New England in the late 1860s provided the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Joseph Loppage. The region's rapidly expanding railroad networks, overcrowded immigrant communities, and overwhelmed law enforcement agencies created an environment where a clever killer could operate with relative impunity, moving between jurisdictions before authorities could establish patterns or coordinate their investigations effectively. Joseph's first confirmed American victim was discovered on a fog-shrouded morning in October 1867, in a wooded area just outside Nashua, New Hampshire. The body belonged to Catherine Morrison, a 19-year-old Irish immigrant who had been working as a seamstress in one of the local textile mills. The condition of her remains would haunt the investigating officers for the rest of their careers and establish a pattern of brutality that would become Joseph's horrifying signature. Catherine had been walking home from a church social when she encountered the monster who would end her life in the most savage manner imaginable. The attack occurred on an isolated stretch of road where her screams would have carried no further than the surrounding trees, a location that Joseph had clearly scouted in advance as part of his methodical approach to murder. The autopsy revealed that Catherine had endured approximately 2 hours of torture before death finally claimed her. Her skull had been fractured in multiple places by what appeared to be a heavy, blunt instrument, most likely a piece of wood or metal wielded with tremendous force. However, these fatal injuries had been inflicted only after she had suffered through a prolonged ordeal that demonstrated her killer's intimate knowledge of human anatomy and his sadistic desire to maximize suffering. What made Catherine's murder particularly disturbing was the ritualistic arrangement of her body and personal effects. Her clothing had been carefully removed and folded beside her corpse, while her jewelry and personal items were arranged in geometric patterns around the crime scene. This level of organization suggested that her killer had remained at the scene for an extended period after her death, taking time to satisfy some twisted compulsion that went far beyond simple murder. The investigation into Catherine's death was hampered by the limited investigative techniques of the era and by the lack of communication between different law enforcement agencies. The concept of a serial killer who operated across jurisdictional boundaries was virtually unknown at the time, making it impossible for authorities to recognize the significance of certain evidence that would seem obvious to modern investigators. Joseph Loppage had begun developing what would become his characteristic modus operandi during this first American kill. He targeted isolated victims who were unlikely to be missed immediately, attacked in locations where discovery would be delayed, and employed methods of torture and murder that satisfied his psychological needs while minimizing the risk of leaving traceable evidence. His second American victim was found nearly 18 months later, in March 1869, in the woods outside Burlington, Vermont. Susan Walsh, a 23-year-old schoolteacher, had disappeared while walking to visit a sick student's family in a rural area outside town. Her body was discovered by hunters 3 days after she failed to return home, arranged in a manner that immediately reminded investigators of the Morrison case in New Hampshire. Susan's murder demonstrated a clear escalation in Joseph's methods and his growing confidence as a killer. The torture had been more prolonged and systematic than in the previous case, with evidence suggesting that she had been kept alive and conscious for most of an entire night. Her skull had been crushed with even more savage force than Catherine Morrison's, indicating that Joseph's physical strength was continuing to develop along with his psychological appetite for violence. The ritualistic elements of the crime scene had also become more elaborate. Susan's personal belongings had been arranged in complex patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic known only to her killer. Her hair had been carefully braided and arranged around her head like a crown, while her clothing had been torn into strips and woven into intricate designs that decorated the trees surrounding her body. Law enforcement agencies in Vermont and New Hampshire began to recognize that they might be dealing with the same killer, but their ability to coordinate investigations across state lines was severely limited by the technology and communication systems of the era. Information traveled slowly between jurisdictions, and there was no centralized system for tracking criminals who operated across multiple states. Joseph Loppage was taking full advantage of these limitations, using his knowledge of the railroad system and his experience as a transient laborer to move quickly between different areas before local authorities could mount effective investigations. His ability to blend in with the immigrant populations of various towns and cities made him virtually invisible to law enforcement officers who lacked the resources to conduct thorough background checks on suspicious individuals. The third American victim was discovered in July 1870 in a forest clearing outside Concord, New Hampshire. Margaret Flynn, a 26-year-old domestic worker, had been visiting relatives in a nearby farming community when she encountered Joseph Loppage on what should have been a routine walk back to town. The crime scene would prove to be the most disturbing yet, providing clear evidence that the killer's methods were becoming increasingly sophisticated and his psychological needs more complex. Margaret's murder showed signs of careful planning and preparation that indicated Joseph was evolving from an opportunistic killer into a methodical predator who stalked specific types of victims. She had been abducted from the main road and transported to a secondary location that provided privacy and security for an extended period of torture and murder. The autopsy revealed that Margaret had been subjected to hours of systematic torture before finally succumbing to massive head trauma. However, unlike the previous victims, she showed signs of having been restrained with professionally tied knots and sophisticated binding techniques that suggested her killer possessed specialized knowledge of rope work and restraint methods. The arrangement of Margaret's body and belongings had become even more elaborate and ritualistic than in the previous cases. Her corpse had been positioned in a manner that seemed to mimic religious iconography, while her personal effects had been arranged in patterns that appeared to follow some form of geometric or mathematical progression. Local newspapers began reporting on what they termed the forest murders, and public panic started to spread throughout New England as residents realized that a sophisticated killer was operating in their communities. Women were warned against traveling alone, and many families began restricting their daughters' movements in ways that hadn't been necessary since the Indian raids of earlier generations. Joseph Loppage was reading these newspaper accounts with evident satisfaction, collecting clippings that documented his growing reputation and the fear he was spreading throughout the region. He had begun keeping detailed journals of his crimes, recording not only the practical aspects of his murders but also his emotional and psychological responses to the violence he was inflicting. The fourth American victim was found in September 1871, near the Connecticut River border between New Hampshire and Vermont. Elizabeth Harper, a 28-year-old mill worker, had been returning from a visit to her sister's family when she encountered the monster who would end her life in the most savage manner yet documented. Elizabeth's murder represented the pinnacle of Joseph's evolving methodology and his growing expertise in the art of inflicting maximum suffering. The crime scene provided evidence that she had been held captive for nearly 24 hours before her death, during which time she had been subjected to tortures so severe that the coroner initially refused to include the full details in his official report. The ritualistic elements of the crime scene had reached new levels of complexity and disturbing symbolism. Elizabeth's body had been arranged in a manner that seemed to tell a story, with her personal belongings positioned to create what appeared to be some form of narrative tableau that existed only in her killer's twisted imagination. By this point, law enforcement agencies throughout New England were beginning to coordinate their investigations more effectively, sharing information about the similarities between the various crime scenes and the possible connections between the victims. However, Joseph Lopage's ability to remain ahead of their efforts was becoming increasingly apparent, as he seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to evade capture while continuing his reign of terror. The psychological profile that was beginning to emerge from the investigation painted a picture of a killer who was both highly intelligent and completely without conscience, someone who viewed human beings as objects to be manipulated and destroyed for his own satisfaction. The methodical nature of his crimes suggested extensive planning and preparation, while the ritualistic elements indicated deep-seated psychological compulsions that were growing stronger with each murder. As 1871 drew to a close, Joseph Lopage had established himself as one of the most dangerous predators ever to operate in North America. His reputation was spreading beyond the immediate crime scenes to law enforcement agencies throughout the United States and Canada, creating the first truly international manhunt in the history of North American crime fighting. The stage was set for the most brutal phase of his killing career, as Joseph Lopage prepared to claim his final victim in a crime so savage and shocking that it would finally provide law enforcement with the evidence they needed to bring his reign of terror to an end. The winter of 1875 settled over New England like a funeral shroud, bringing with it an atmosphere of dread that seemed to permeate every snow-covered town and village throughout the region. Joseph Lopage had been conspicuously absent from the crime reports for nearly 4 years, leading some authorities to hope that the monster had either died or moved on to terrorize other regions. However, those who had studied his methods most closely understood that his silence likely meant he was planning something far more elaborate and horrifying than anything he had attempted before. During his years of apparent inactivity, Joseph had not been idle. He had been studying, learning, and perfecting his craft with the dedication of a scholar pursuing an advanced degree in death. He had traveled extensively throughout New England and eastern Canada, mapping out potential hunting grounds, identifying victims, and developing increasingly sophisticated methods for evading detection and capture. His journals from this period, which would later be discovered by investigators, revealed a mind that had become completely consumed by fantasies of violence and domination. The entries detailed elaborate scenarios for future murders, complete with diagrams of torture devices and carefully planned crime scenes that would serve both his psychological needs and his desire for recognition as a superior predator. Joseph had also spent considerable time studying law enforcement techniques and investigative methods, reading newspaper accounts of other criminal cases and analyzing the mistakes that had led to various killers being captured. He was determined that his final crime would be so perfectly executed that it would serve as his masterpiece, a demonstration of his superiority over both his victims and those who sought to bring him to justice. The woman who would become his ultimate victim was Marietta Ball, a 24-year-old schoolteacher from Pembroke, New Hampshire, who possessed all the qualities that had attracted Joseph's attention in his previous targets. She was intelligent, independent, and beautiful, characteristics that seemed to trigger his most violent impulses while simultaneously representing everything he felt had been denied to him in his own life. Marietta Ball was beloved in her community for her dedication to her students and her involvement in various charitable activities. She lived with her elderly parents in a modest home on the outskirts of town, and she was known for her habit of taking long walks in the surrounding countryside to gather her thoughts and prepare her lessons for the following day. Joseph Loppage had been observing Marietta for several months before he finally decided to make her his target. He had studied her routines with the patience of a naturalist documenting the behavior of wild animals, noting her preferred walking routes, her typical schedule, and the times when she was most likely to be alone and vulnerable. On the morning of December 9, 1875, Marietta Ball left her home for what she expected to be a routine walk through the snow-covered woods that surrounded Pembroke. The temperature was well below freezing, and the landscape was blanketed in fresh snow that muffled sound and created an almost supernatural silence throughout the forest. It was the perfect setting for the nightmare that was about to unfold. Joseph Loppage had positioned himself along Marietta's usual route, hidden behind a massive oak tree that provided perfect concealment while allowing him to observe her approach. He had been waiting for nearly 3 hours, his body generating the kind of nervous energy that had sustained him through previous hunts and his mind already savoring the violence that was about to occur. When Marietta finally appeared on the forest path, wrapped in a heavy woolen coat and moving with the graceful confidence that had attracted Joseph's attention, the killer knew that his moment had finally arrived. He emerged from his hiding place with the fluid motion of a predator that has perfected its technique through years of practice and countless hours of mental rehearsal. The initial attack was swift and brutal, designed to incapacitate the victim while leaving her conscious enough to experience everything that would follow. Joseph struck Marietta with a wooden club that he had carved specifically for this purpose, delivering a blow that fractured her skull but did not immediately kill her. She collapsed into the snow, her blood creating stark crimson patterns against the pristine white landscape. What followed was a prolonged ordeal that would later be described by investigators as the most savage and methodical torture ever documented in a North American crime scene. Joseph Loppage spent nearly 6 hours with his victim, subjecting her to forms of physical and psychological torment that seemed to draw from every twisted fantasy he had developed during his years of planning and preparation. The details of Marietta Ball's suffering were so disturbing that the official police reports were sealed for more than 50 years. And even today, many of the specific aspects of her torture remain too graphic for public disclosure. What can be stated is that Joseph Loppage demonstrated a level of cruelty and inventiveness that shocked even experienced investigators who had seen the worst that human beings were capable of inflicting upon one another. The ritualistic elements of the crime scene reached new heights of complexity and symbolic meaning that existed only in Joseph's diseased imagination. Marietta's body was arranged in a manner that seemed to tell an elaborate story, with her personal belongings and clothing positioned to create what appeared to be some form of macabre theatrical performance. However, Joseph Loppage's confidence in his ability to evade capture would prove to be his ultimate downfall. The extended time he spent at the crime scene, combined with the fresh snowfall that had begun during the attack, created a perfect record of his movements and activities. His footprints were preserved in the snow, providing investigators with detailed information about his size, gait, and the specific boots he had been wearing. More significantly, Joseph had made the crucial mistake of leaving behind a distinctive piece of personal property, a leather glove that had been specially modified with metal studs and reinforced knuckles. This glove bore unique markings that could be traced directly back to its owner, providing law enforcement with their first concrete piece of physical evidence linking Joseph Loppage to any of his crimes. The discovery of Marietta Ball's body on December 12, 1875, sent shockwaves throughout New England and triggered the largest manhunt in the region's history. Dozens of law enforcement officers from multiple jurisdictions converged on Pembroke, along with teams of volunteers who were determined to bring the monster to justice before he could claim another victim. The investigation was led by Detective Charles Walker of the New Hampshire State Police, a methodical and experienced investigator who had been studying Joseph Loppage's crimes for several years. Walker immediately recognized the signature elements of the killer's methodology, but he also noted significant differences that suggested Joseph was becoming increasingly reckless and overconfident. The physical evidence collected at the crime scene was more extensive and detailed than anything investigators had previously obtained. In addition to the footprints and the distinctive glove, they found hair samples, fabric fragments, and what appeared to be samples of the killer's blood from cuts he had suffered during his prolonged assault on his victim. Detective Walker coordinated with law enforcement agencies throughout New England and eastern Canada, sharing detailed descriptions of the physical evidence and the specific characteristics that would identify Joseph Loppage if he attempted to seek medical treatment for his injuries or if he tried to replace the glove he had left behind. The breakthrough in the case came when a shopkeeper in Manchester, New Hampshire, reported a suspicious customer who had attempted to purchase gloves matching the description that had been circulated to local businesses. The customer had paid with gold coins that were unusual for the region and had displayed injuries consistent with those that the killer would have suffered during his attack on Marietta Ball. Within hours of receiving this report, Detective Walker and a team of officers had traced the customer to a boarding house on the outskirts of Manchester, where they discovered Joseph Loppage attempting to treat his wounds and prepare for another disappearance. The arrest was accomplished without violence, as Joseph seemed to understand that his reign of terror had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The capture of Joseph Loppage marked the end of one of the most extensive and terrifying crime sprees in North American history. However, his arrest was just the beginning of a legal process that would captivate the public imagination and provide new insights into the mind of a killer whose crimes had challenged everything that civilized society thought it understood about human evil. The arrest of Joseph Loppage in that snow-dusted Manchester boarding house marked the beginning of what would become one of the most sensational and closely watched criminal trials in 19th century American history. The monster who had terrorized two nations for nearly a decade was finally in custody, but the legal proceedings that would determine his fate would prove to be almost as dramatic and disturbing as the crimes themselves. Detective Charles Walker's interrogation of Joseph Loppage revealed a man who seemed almost relieved to have been captured, as though the psychological burden of maintaining his facade of normalcy had become more exhausting than the thrill of murder itself. However, any hope that Joseph might cooperate with authorities or show remorse for his actions was quickly dispelled by his behavior during the initial questioning sessions. Joseph displayed an unsettling combination of arrogance and detachment when discussing his crimes, speaking about the murders with the clinical precision of a medical researcher describing laboratory experiments. He showed no emotional response when confronted with evidence of his victim's suffering, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the investigators' apparent belief that he should feel guilt or regret for his actions. The physical evidence linking Joseph to the murder of Marietta Ball was overwhelming and irrefutable. The distinctive glove found at the crime scene matched perfectly with the one missing from his belongings, while the footprint analysis provided conclusive proof that he had been present during the attack. Hair and fabric samples collected from the scene were consistent with Joseph's appearance and clothing, creating a web of forensic evidence that would have been impressive even by modern standards. However, connecting Joseph to his earlier victims proved to be far more challenging. The passage of time had degraded much of the physical evidence from the previous crime scenes, and witness testimony from events that had occurred years earlier was often unreliable or contradictory. Detective Walker and his team faced the daunting task of building cases for multiple murders using investigative techniques that were still in their infancy. The legal proceedings were complicated by Joseph's decision to represent himself in court, a choice that allowed him to cross-examine witnesses and present his own defense while providing the public with disturbing insights into his psychological state and his attitudes toward his victims. His courtroom behavior would prove to be almost as shocking as the crimes themselves, as he seemed to view the trial as an opportunity to relive and celebrate his violent achievements. Joseph's defense strategy was both bizarre and chilling in its implications. Rather than denying his involvement in the murders or claiming temporary insanity, he argued that his actions were justified by what he perceived as the inherent worthlessness of human life and the natural right of superior individuals to dominate those weaker than themselves. His courtroom speeches revealed a philosophy that was equal parts social Darwinism and pure nihilism, filtered through a mind that had been completely corrupted by years of violence and degradation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Morrison, faced the challenge of presenting evidence that was often too graphic and disturbing for the sensibilities of 19th century jurors and spectators. Many of the specific details of Joseph's torture methods had to be presented in closed sessions, while sanitized versions were provided for public consumption and newspaper reporting. Witness testimony provided haunting glimpses into Joseph's character and the impact his crimes had on the communities where they occurred. Former neighbors from his childhood in Quebec described a boy who had seemed fundamentally different from other children, while survivors of his non-fatal attacks provided chilling accounts of encounters with a predator who seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human behavior. The trial attracted national attention, with reporters from newspapers throughout the United States and Canada converging on the courthouse to document every aspect of the proceedings. The public's fascination with the case reflected both their horror at Joseph's crimes and their morbid curiosity about the psychological mechanisms that could produce such a monster. Joseph's cross-examination of prosecution witnesses revealed his intimate knowledge of legal procedures and his ability to manipulate courtroom protocols for his own purposes. He seemed to take particular pleasure in forcing his victims' family members to relive the details of their loved ones' deaths, asking questions that served no legitimate legal purpose beyond satisfying his continued need to inflict psychological suffering. The testimony of medical experts provided some of the most disturbing revelations of the trial, as forensic specialists described the systematic nature of Joseph's torture methods and the evidence suggesting that he had continued to refine and perfect his techniques throughout his criminal career. The wounds inflicted on his victims showed clear signs of anatomical knowledge and careful planning, indicating that each murder had served as both an end in itself and preparation for future crimes. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Joseph Loppage represented something new and terrifying in the landscape of American crime. A killer who combined intelligence, physical capability, and complete moral emptiness in ways that challenged existing legal and social frameworks for understanding and responding to criminal behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on all charges related to the murder of Marietta Ball. The speed of their decision reflected not only the overwhelming nature of the evidence, but also their apparent disgust at Joseph's behavior throughout the trial and his complete lack of remorse for his actions. Judge Samuel Crawford's sentencing statement would be remembered as one of the most powerful and comprehensive condemnations of criminal behavior in American legal history. He described Joseph Loppage as a creature who has forfeited all claim to membership in civilized society, and whose crimes represented an assault upon the fundamental principles that distinguish human beings from wild beasts. The sentence of death by hanging was delivered with unusual ceremony and gravity, reflecting both the severity of Joseph's crimes and the symbolic importance of his execution as a statement about society's commitment to protecting innocent life. Judge Crawford specified that the execution would be carried out in public, allowing the community to witness the final chapter of the monster story. Joseph's reaction to the death sentence was characteristically disturbing, as he seemed more concerned with the historical significance of his case than with the prospect of his own death. He requested writing materials so that he could compose what he described as his memoirs, claiming that future generations would recognize him as a pioneer in the evolution of human consciousness beyond traditional moral limitations. The months between sentencing and execution were marked by numerous attempts by various religious figures to elicit some expression of repentance or spiritual awakening from Joseph. However, these efforts proved futile, as he remained convinced that his crimes represented a form of natural selection and that his victims had simply demonstrated their unfitness for survival. Joseph's final writings, composed during his months on death row, provided investigators and early criminal psychologists with unprecedented insights into the mind of a serial killer. His detailed descriptions of his crimes and his analysis of his own motivations would later influence the development of criminal profiling techniques and psychological theories about the origins of violent behavior. On the morning of March 15, 1878, Joseph Loppage was led to the gallows that had been erected in the courtyard of the New Hampshire State Prison. Hundreds of spectators had gathered to witness the execution, including many who had traveled considerable distances to see justice finally served upon the man who had terrorized their communities for so many years. Joseph's final statement was brief and characteristically unrepentant. He expressed no remorse for his victims and no fear of death, claiming that his execution would serve only to transform him into a legend that would inspire others to follow in his path. His words sent chills through the assembled crowd and reinforced their conviction that the world would be safer with him gone. The execution was carried out with mechanical precision at precisely 10 a.m., as Joseph Loppage's neck was snapped by the hangman's rope with the same finality that he had imposed upon his victims. However, even in death, the French monster's influence would continue to be felt, as his case became a touchstone for understanding the psychological and social factors that create such predators. The immediate aftermath of Joseph's execution was marked by a sense of relief throughout New England, as communities that had lived in fear for nearly a decade finally felt safe to resume their normal patterns of life. Women could walk alone without constantly looking over their shoulders, and parents could allow their children greater freedom without worrying about monsters lurking in the shadows. However, the long-term impact of Joseph Lopage's crimes extended far beyond the immediate relief provided by his death. His case had demonstrated the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies across jurisdictional boundaries, leading to improved communication systems and investigative techniques that would prove crucial in future criminal cases. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Joseph's crimes and writings would influence the development of criminal psychology and forensic psychiatry for generations to come. His case provided early insights into the minds of serial killers and the factors that contribute to the development of such extreme antisocial behavior. Perhaps most significantly, the French monster's reign of terror had forever changed how society thought about the nature of evil and the capacity for human cruelty. Joseph Lopage had demonstrated that monsters were not mythical creatures from folklore but real human beings who could walk among us undetected while harboring the most horrific intentions. The execution of Joseph Lopage marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in North American criminal history, but it also served as a grim reminder that the capacity for such evil exists within the human species and that eternal vigilance is the price of protecting innocent life from those who would destroy it for their own twisted satisfaction. The French monster was dead, but the lessons learned from his crimes would live on, informing future efforts to understand, identify, and stop those who would follow in his bloody footsteps. His name would be remembered not as the legend he hoped to become, but as a cautionary tale about the depths to which the human soul can sink when conscience is abandoned and evil is embraced as a way of life. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5. The Killer with the ADZ, the Sokrat Kirschwang Chronicles. Beneath the cobblestone streets of Eastern Europe, where shadows dance with whispered secrets and ancient tools become instruments of unthinkable horror, there lived a man whose very name would become synonymous with calculated brutality. Sokrat Kirschwang, a name that would echo through courthouse halls and haunt the nightmares of an entire generation. Armed with nothing more than a carpenter's adze, this methodical predator carved a path of terror so precise, so deliberate, that even hardened investigators would struggle to comprehend the depths of his depravity. Between 1919 and 1937, Kirschwang wielded his chosen weapon with the precision of a surgeon and the malice of a demon. The adze, that curved, razor-sharp tool designed to shape wood, became his signature, his calling card, his instrument of absolute destruction. For lives would fall victim to his calculated madness, each murder more chilling than the last, each swing of that cursed blade sealing another fate in blood and terror. This is not merely a tale of murder. This is the chronicle of a monster who found poetry in violence, who transformed love into betrayal, and who proved that sometimes the most ordinary tools can become instruments of extraordinary evil. Welcome to the haunting legacy of the killer with the adze, a story that will leave you questioning the darkness that may lurk behind familiar faces. The year was 1919, and the world was still bleeding from the wounds of the Great War. Cities across Eastern Europe bore the scars of conflict, their streets lined with broken dreams and shattered souls. It was against this backdrop of devastation that Sokrat Kirschwang first revealed the monster that had been festering within his soul like a malignant tumor. Kirschwang was not what one might expect of a killer. Standing at average height with unremarkable features, he possessed the kind of face that disappeared into crowds, a blessing for a predator, a curse for those who would encounter him in intimate moments. His hands, calloused from years of carpentry work, had grown intimately familiar with the weight and balance of various tools. But none called to him quite like the adze. The adze itself was a thing of practical beauty, a curved blade mounted perpendicular to its handle, designed to hollow out wood with precise, controlled strikes. In the hands of a craftsman, it could transform rough timber into objects of utility and grace. In Kirschwang's grip, it would become something far more sinister. His first victim was Milena Dvorak, a woman whose only crime was believing in the capacity for human goodness. She had met Kirschwang during the autumn of 1918, when the leaves were dying and the world seemed draped in melancholy. Milena, with her auburn hair that caught lamplight like captured fire, worked as a seamstress in the textile district. Her fingers, nimble from years of delicate work, had traced the contours of Kirschwang's face in moments of tenderness that now seem obscene in hindsight. Their courtship unfolded like a carefully orchestrated deception. Kirschwang presented himself as a wounded soul seeking solace in the aftermath of war. He spoke of lost brothers, of trenches filled with screaming men, of nights when sleep brought nothing but nightmares. Milena, possessed of a compassionate heart that would ultimately doom her, opened her world to this seemingly broken man. For months, they shared a modest apartment above a bakery. The scent of fresh bread would rise through the floorboards each morning, mingling with the aroma of coffee and the soft sounds of a city awakening. Milena would rise early, her movements careful not to disturb her lover's sleep. She would dress by candlelight, her silhouette dancing against the walls like a ghostly premonition of the horror to come. Kirschwang observed everything with the patience of a predator. He studied the rhythm of Milena's breathing as she slept. He memorized the exact moment when she was most vulnerable, that liminal space between deep sleep and waking consciousness when the mind struggles to distinguish reality from dream. He noted how she turned her head when startled, how her hand instinctively moved to her throat when frightened. The relationship began to sour as winter tightened its grip on the city. Kirschwang's mask of civilized behavior started to slip, revealing glimpses of the darkness beneath. He became possessive, paranoid, convinced that Milena was betraying him with imagined lovers. His accusations grew more vicious, his temper more volatile. The man who had once spoken of love began to speak of possession, of ownership, of the terrible things that happened to those who dared to deceive him. Milena, trapped between love and fear, tried desperately to salvage what remained of their relationship. She made excuses for his behavior, convinced herself that his jealousy stemmed from the trauma of war. She told herself that, with patience and understanding, she could heal the wounds in his soul. How tragically wrong she was. The murder occurred on a February night when the wind howled through the streets like a banshee's wail. Kirschwang had been drinking, his inhibitions dissolved in cheap vodka, his violent fantasies given free rein. Milena had returned home late from work, delayed by a particularly complex dress that required her attention well into the evening. She found him waiting in the darkness of their apartment, his face a mask of cold fury. "You're late," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an accusation and a death sentence. Milena attempted to explain, her words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. But Kirschwang was no longer listening. In his twisted mind, her tardiness was proof of infidelity, confirmation of every paranoid delusion that had been consuming him for weeks. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his hand reaching for the tool belt he kept beside the door. The adze felt familiar in his grip, its weight perfectly balanced, its blade sharp enough to split wood with a single blow. As he lifted it, Milena finally understood the true nature of the man she had loved. Terror transformed her features, turning her face into a mask of absolute horror. She tried to run, but the apartment was small, the exits few. What happened next defied every notion of civilized human behavior. Kirschwang struck with calculated precision, the curved blade of the adze finding its target with horrifying accuracy. The first blow caught Milena across the temple, the impact producing a sound like a melon cracking under pressure. She collapsed instantly, blood pooling beneath her auburn hair, now matted and darkened with gore. But Kirschwang was not finished. Something had awakened within him during that first strike, a hunger that demanded satisfaction, a darkness that reveled in the act of destruction. He struck again, and again, each blow delivered with the methodical precision of a craftsman shaping his material. The adze, designed to hollow out wood, hollowed out Milena's skull with terrible efficiency. Blood painted the walls in arterial sprays, creating abstract patterns that spoke of violence and madness. The scent of copper filled the air, mixing with the lingering aroma of bread from the bakery below in a grotesque juxtaposition of life and death. Milena's body convulsed with each impact, her nervous system firing in random patterns as her brain struggled, to process the catastrophic damage being inflicted upon it. When Kirschvang finally stopped, exhaustion rather than mercy staying his hand, the room looked like a slaughterhouse. Milena's body lay twisted and broken, her face rendered unrecognizable by the repeated impacts of the adze. Brain matter clung to the walls like grotesque wallpaper, and the floorboards were saturated with blood that would take days to fully congeal. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Kirschvang's reaction to what he had done. Rather than horror or remorse, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction, as if he had completed a work of art. He stood over Milena's corpse, the bloody adze still clutched in his hand, and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had discovered his true calling. The second murder followed a disturbingly similar pattern, though the victim was different. Elena Vasquez was a baker's daughter, her hands perpetually dusted with flour, her smile warm enough to melt the coldest heart. She had encountered Kirschvang in the weeks following Milena's death, when he was crafting his next deception with the skill of a master manipulator. Elena possessed a trusting nature that made her particularly vulnerable to Kirschvang's charms. She believed in the inherent goodness of people, a worldview that would prove catastrophically naive. When Kirschvang presented himself as a widower still mourning his deceased wife, a lie wrapped in just enough truth to be convincing, Elena's compassionate heart went out to him. Their relationship progressed with frightening speed. Kirschvang, emboldened by his success in manipulating and murdering Milena, refined his techniques. He became more adept at reading his victims' emotional responses, more skilled at identifying and exploiting their weaknesses. Elena, with her desire to heal wounded souls, fell completely under his spell. She would bring him fresh bread in the mornings, her face glowing with the simple joy of nurturing someone she believed needed care. She would listen to his fabricated stories of loss and trauma, her eyes bright with unshed tears of sympathy. She never suspected that the man she was trying to heal was actually the architect of her destruction. Kirschvang chose to end Elena's life on a spring evening when the air was thick with the promise of renewal, a cruel irony that was not lost on him. He had been planning her death for weeks, savoring the anticipation like a fine wine. The adze had been cleaned and sharpened, its blade honed to razor precision. Elena arrived at his apartment carrying a basket of sweet rolls, still warm from her father's ovens. She was humming a simple melody, her voice light and carefree. She had no way of knowing that she was walking into her tomb, that the man she loved was preparing to transform her into nothing more than scattered flesh and bone. The attack began much as it had with Milena, though Kirschvang had learned from his previous experience. This time, he positioned himself more strategically, ensuring that Elena would have no chance of escape. When he revealed the adze, her confusion was almost as heartbreaking as her terror. "Sokrat," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing?" He answered her with violence, the curved blade describing a perfect arc through the air before connecting with devastating force. Elena's scream died in her throat as the adze split her skull like kindling. But unlike with Milena, Kirschvang's attack on Elena was even more methodical, more deliberate. He had spent weeks studying anatomy, learning the precise locations where the adze would cause maximum damage. He understood now which angles would produce the most spectacular sprays of blood, which strikes would prolong his victim's suffering, which wounds would kill quickly versus those that would allow for extended agony. Elena endured 17 separate blows before her body finally surrendered to death. Each strike was calculated to maximize both physical trauma and psychological terror. Kirschvang spoke to her throughout the attack, his voice calm and conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than systematically destroying another human being. "Can you feel that, Elena?" he would ask after particularly devastating impacts. "That's your skull fragmenting. Those are pieces of your brain sliding down your face." The psychological torture was perhaps even more horrifying than the physical violence. Elena remained conscious for far longer than should have been possible, her mind trapped in a body that was being methodically dismantled. She experienced every moment of her destruction with crystal clarity, understanding exactly what was happening to her, but powerless to prevent it. When it was finally over, Kirschvang stood amidst the carnage with the satisfaction of a job well done. Elena's body lay in pieces, quite literally, the adze having performed its function with gruesome efficiency. Blood covered every surface in the room, and the sweet scent of the rolls she had brought now mingled obscenely with the copper tang of spilled life. The authorities discovered both crime scenes within days of each other, the similarities too obvious to ignore. The precision of the wounds, the specific pattern of trauma, the use of the same unusual weapon. Everything pointed to a single perpetrator with a very particular set of skills and predilections. The investigation that followed was hampered by the chaos of post-war Europe. Resources were limited, forensic science was primitive, and the sheer brutality of the crimes left even experienced investigators struggling to comprehend what they were dealing with. But eventually, through witness testimony and physical evidence, the trail led back to Sokrat Kirschving. His arrest came on a morning when spring rain was washing the blood from the city's cobblestones. Police officers surrounded his latest hiding place, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they were confronting. Kirschving offered no resistance, seemingly almost pleased that his work was finally being recognized. During his interrogation, he displayed a chilling lack of remorse. He spoke of Milena and Elena not as human beings whose lives he had stolen, but as artistic projects he had completed. He described the technical aspects of their murders with the detached professionalism of a craftsman discussing his trade. "The adze is the perfect tool," he explained to horrified investigators. "It's precise, efficient, and versatile. You can create so many different effects with just small changes in angle and force." When asked why he had killed the two women, Kirschving's response was as disturbing as it was revealing. "Because I could, because they trusted me completely, and that trust gave me power over them. The power of life and death is the ultimate intimacy." The trial that followed captivated the region's attention. Newspapers carried detailed accounts of Kirschving's crimes, their pages filled with descriptions of violence so extreme that many readers could barely comprehend what they were reading. The prosecution painted him as a monster in human form, while the defense attempted unsuccessfully to argue for insanity. Kirschving himself seemed to enjoy the attention, treating the proceedings like a performance with himself as the star. He would smile at particularly graphic testimony, nod approvingly when witnesses described finding the crime scenes, and occasionally offer his own technical corrections to inaccurate details about his methods. The verdict was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, Kirschving's guilt undeniable. He was sentenced to death, the judge's words carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. For crimes so heinous that they challenge our very understanding of human nature, there can be only one response. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Sokrat Kirschving. His execution was stayed, his sentence commuted to 17 years in prison, a decision that would prove to have catastrophic consequences for future victims. The monster would not die. He would simply wait, planning and preparing for the day when he could once again wield his beloved adze. As Kirschving was led away to begin his prison sentence, observers noted the expression on his face. It was not one of defeat or despair, but of patience. The look of a predator who understood that sometimes the hunt required long periods of waiting. The look of a man who knew that his story was far from over. The people of the region breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that justice had been served and the nightmare had ended. They could not have imagined that their mercy would become the foundation for future horrors, that in sparing Kirschving's life, they had merely postponed the inevitable continuation of his bloody work. The killer with the adze was going to prison, but he was taking his knowledge, his skills, and his insatiable hunger for violence with him. The next chapter of his story would unfold 18 years later, when an older, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous Sokrat Kirschving would once again walk free among the innocent. The iron gates of Kronstadt maximum security prison clanged shut behind Sokrat Kirschving with a finality that should have marked the end of his reign of terror. Instead, those 18 years of incarceration would serve as a twisted university, transforming an already dangerous killer into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more lethal. Kronstadt prison was a monument to human suffering, built during the previous century when the philosophy of imprisonment focused more on punishment than rehabilitation. Its walls, blackened by decades of coal soot and despair, rose like monoliths from the barren landscape. The facility housed the region's most dangerous criminals, murderers, rapists, political dissidents, and those whose crimes defied easy categorization. For most inmates, Kronstadt was hell on earth. The cells were barely large enough for a man to lie down, the food was barely sufficient to sustain life, and violence was as common as breathing. Guards ruled through fear and brutality, while the prisoners themselves had developed their own savage hierarchy based on the capacity for inflicting pain. But Sokrat Kirschwang was not most inmates. Where others saw only suffering and degradation, he recognized opportunity. The prison became his laboratory, the other inmates his unwitting subjects in a series of psychological experiments designed to perfect his understanding of human nature's darkest corners. From the moment he arrived, Kirschwang began studying his fellow prisoners with the same methodical precision he had once applied to his craft. He observed how power dynamics shifted in the harsh ecosystem of prison life. He watched as strong men were broken by isolation, as the weak found ways to survive through cunning and manipulation, as violence became the universal language of respect and fear. His cellmate for the first 3 years was Dmitry Volkov, a mountain of a man serving time for beating a tavern keeper to death with his bare hands. Volkov had expected to dominate the slight carpenter, to establish his superiority through the traditional methods of prison intimidation. Instead, he found himself increasingly unsettled by his new companion's penetrating stare and unsettling questions. Kirschwang would lie on his narrow bunk at night, staring at the ceiling while conducting quiet conversations that gradually peeled away the layers of Volkov's psyche. He learned about the man's childhood traumas, his relationship with his brutal father, the specific triggers that could transform him from sullen passivity to explosive violence. "Tell me about the moment you knew you were going to kill him," Kirschwang would whisper in the darkness, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Volkov, starved for human connection despite his fearsome reputation, found himself sharing details he had never spoken aloud. He described the precise instant when rational thought had disappeared, replaced by a red haze of fury that demanded blood. He talked about the satisfying crunch of bone beneath his knuckles, the way the tavern keeper's eyes had bulged with terror and surprise. These conversations served multiple purposes for Kirschwang. They satisfied his intellectual curiosity about the mechanics of violence, but they also provided valuable insights into the psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He was learning to read people like open books, to identify the exact words and actions that could push them toward desired behaviors. More importantly, he was discovering that his appetite for violence had not diminished during his incarceration. If anything, the forced abstinence had sharpened his hunger, transforming it into something more refined and dangerous. He began to fantasize about his release, about the perfect victims he would select, about the improved techniques he would employ. The prison workshop became another classroom in Kirschwang's twisted education. Ostensibly designed to teach inmates useful trades that might help them reintegrate into society, the woodworking shop provided him with access to tools and techniques he had never mastered. Under the supervision of a guard who was more interested in sleeping than monitoring, Kirschwang spent countless hours perfecting his craftsmanship. But his focus was not on creating useful objects. Instead, he devoted himself to understanding the precise relationship between force, angle, and penetration. He tested different blade shapes on various types of wood, studying how each configuration affected the resulting damage. He learned to sharpen edges to surgical precision, to balance handles for maximum control, to identify the exact points where even slight pressure could cause catastrophic failure. The other inmates began to notice Kirschwang's unusual behavior. While they carved crude decorations or practical items, he worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His pieces were geometric studies in destruction, abstract representations of wounds, sculptures that suggested violence without explicitly depicting it. "What the hell are you making?" asked Boris Petrov, a counterfeiter serving 7 years for flooding the market with fake currency. Kirschwang looked up from his work, a wooden model that vaguely resembled a human head sectioned to show internal structures. His smile was perfectly pleasant, completely at odds with the disturbing nature of his creation. "I'm studying anatomy," he replied simply, "understanding how things come apart." The prison library, such as it was, became another resource for Kirschvang's self-education. The collection was limited and heavily censored, but he managed to find medical textbooks, anatomy guides, and even some outdated forensic manuals that previous inmates had somehow acquired. He read voraciously, absorbing information about human physiology, nerve pathways, and the specific injuries that would cause maximum trauma while prolonging consciousness. He also discovered books on psychology, criminal behavior, and investigative techniques. These proved invaluable in helping him understand not just how to commit more effective murders, but how to avoid detection afterward. He studied the mistakes of other killers, the evidence they had left behind, the behavioral patterns that had ultimately led to their capture. Perhaps most importantly, he began to develop what would later be recognized as an almost supernatural ability to manipulate other people. He practiced on his fellow inmates, gradually learning to identify their psychological pressure points and exploit them for his own purposes. There was Marcus Hedren, a political prisoner whose revolutionary fervor had landed him a 10-year sentence. Kirschvang spent months carefully building a relationship with him, appearing to share his ideological convictions while gradually steering their conversations toward more violent possibilities. By the end of their association, Hedren was planning elaborate revenge fantasies that would have made Kirschvang's previous crimes seem restrained by comparison. Then there was Pavel Kozlov, a small-time thief who had developed an almost pathological fear of confrontation after being repeatedly brutalized by larger inmates. Kirschvang befriended him, offering protection and guidance while slowly introducing ideas about the power that came from being feared rather than pitted. The transformation was remarkable. Within months, Kozlov had evolved from victim to predator, using techniques that Kirschvang had subtly suggested to establish dominance over other vulnerable prisoners. These experiments in human manipulation served as proof of concept for Kirschvang's evolving understanding of psychology. He was learning to identify the fundamental drives that motivated people: fear, desire, pride, shame, and to use those drives as tools for achieving his own objectives. But perhaps the most significant development during his incarceration was Kirschvang's evolving relationship with his chosen weapon. Unable to practice with an actual adze, he began crafting substitutes from whatever materials he could acquire. Sharpened spoons became miniature versions of his beloved tool. Pieces of metal salvaged from workshop projects were carefully shaped and balanced to approximate the weight and feel of a proper adze. He would practice in his cell during the long hours when the prison was locked down, moving through precise choreographed motions that simulated different attack patterns. He studied the biomechanics of his own movements, identifying ways to generate more force, achieve better accuracy, and maintain control during extended periods of violence. Other inmates occasionally glimpsed these practice sessions through the bars of their cells. They would see Kirschvang moving through what looked like a deadly dance, his makeshift weapon tracing complex patterns through the air while his face remained utterly focused and serene. The sight was profoundly unsettling, even for men who had committed serious crimes themselves. "He's not practicing carpentry," whispered Alexei Romanov, a burglar serving time in the adjacent cell. "He's practicing murder." As the years passed, Kirschvang's reputation within the prison began to shift. Initially dismissed as just another killer among many, he gradually came to be regarded with a mixture of fear and fascination. Inmates would seek him out for advice on personal conflicts, attracted by his apparent wisdom and emotional detachment. Guards found themselves unconsciously deferring to him, unsettled by his penetrating gaze and unervingly calm demeanor. He never committed violence during his incarceration, at least, none that could be definitively proven. But several inmates who had crossed him met with mysterious accidents. Pavel Smirnov, who had attempted to extort protection money from Kirschvang, was found at the bottom of a stairwell with injuries consistent with a fall. Investigations revealed nothing suspicious, but other prisoners knew better than to test the quiet carpenter's patience. Mikhail Orlov, who had made the mistake of threatening Kirschvang during a dispute over workshop time, was discovered in his cell with a sharpened spoon protruding from his throat. The angle of penetration was remarkably precise, designed to cause maximum damage to vital structures while minimizing external bleeding. The murder weapon's craftsmanship was so exceptional that even the investigating detectives commented on its deadly efficiency. No evidence ever connected Kirschwang to these incidents, but the message was clear to anyone with the intelligence to understand it. The carpenter was not someone to be trifled with, regardless of his mild appearance and soft-spoken manner. During his final years in prison, Kirschwang began to focus on preparing for his eventual release. He knew that the world outside had changed during his incarceration, that new technologies and investigative techniques would present different challenges for someone planning to resume a career in murder. He cultivated relationships with inmates who had maintained connections to the outside world, learning about developments in police procedures, forensic science, and communications technology. He studied the cases of killers who had been captured during his imprisonment, analyzing their mistakes and incorporating the lessons into his own evolving methodology. Most importantly, he began to identify potential victims for his post-release activities. Through careful questioning of guards and other inmates, he learned about people in the community who might fit his preferred profile, individuals who were isolated, trusting, and unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. His aunt, Katerina Kirschwang, and her husband, Nikolai Petrov, emerged as particularly attractive targets. They lived alone on a small farm outside the city, relatively isolated from neighbors and suspicious of law enforcement. They had modest savings hidden somewhere on their property, which could provide funding for Kirschwang's future activities. Most importantly, they felt obligated to help him as family, a sense of duty that he intended to exploit ruthlessly. Kirschwang began corresponding with them during his final years of imprisonment, crafting letters that carefully balanced expressions of remorse with subtle manipulations designed to ensure they would welcome him upon his release. He wrote of his spiritual transformation in prison, his newfound understanding of the value of human life, his desperate desire to make amends for his past mistakes. "My dear Aunt Katerina," read one particularly effective letter. "The darkness that once consumed my soul has been burned away by years of contemplation and prayer. I understand now the magnitude of my crimes, and I am committed to spending whatever remains of my life in service to others. When I am released, I hope only to find a quiet place where I can work with my hands and harm no living thing. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I pray that you might find it in your heart to help me begin again." The responses he received confirmed that his manipulation was working perfectly. Katerina wrote of her joy at his spiritual transformation, her eagerness to help him reintegrate into society, her plans to prepare a room for him in their farmhouse. She even mentioned that Nikolai, despite his initial skepticism, had been won over by the sincerity evident in Kirschwang's letters. What neither of them understood was that they were reading correspondence from a predator who had spent 18 years perfecting his ability to identify and exploit human weaknesses. The man they believed had found redemption had actually discovered something far more dangerous, a sophisticated understanding of how to use other people's compassion as a weapon against them. As his release date approached, Kirschwang experienced a profound sense of anticipation unlike anything he had felt since those first moments wielding the adze. The years of study, practice, and preparation were about to be put to the ultimate test. He had entered prison as a brutal but relatively unsophisticated killer. He would leave as something far more dangerous, a predator equipped with nearly 2 decades of accumulated knowledge about human psychology, criminal methodology, and the art of avoiding detection. The final weeks of his sentence crawled by with agonizing slowness. Kirschwang found himself unable to concentrate on his usual activities, his mind constantly focused on the moment when he would once again be free to pursue his true calling. He had already begun selecting the specific tools he would need, planning the approach he would take with his aunt and uncle-in-law, envisioning the improvements he would make to his technique. Other inmates noticed the change in his demeanor. There was an electricity about him now, a barely contained excitement that made even the most hardened criminals uncomfortable. They could sense that something was building, that the quiet carpenter was preparing for something significant. On the morning of his release, Sokrat Kirschwang walked through the prison gates with the measured stride of a man who had accomplished something important. He carried only a small bag containing his few possessions and a wooden box he had crafted in the workshop, a container that would soon house his most precious tool. The sun felt warm on his face as he stood outside the prison walls, breathing free air for the first time in 18 years. But his thoughts were not focused on freedom or redemption. Instead, he was calculating distances to his aunt's farm, considering the best approach routes, and savoring the anticipation of once again feeling the familiar weight of an adze in his hands. Sokrat Kirschvang had served his sentence and paid his debt to society. Now it was time for society to pay its debt to him. The killer with the adze was back in the world, more dangerous than ever, and hungry for the violence that had been denied him for far too long. The nightmare was about to resume, but this time with a protagonist who had been educated by nearly 2 decades of careful study and preparation. What followed would make his previous crimes seem like crude practice runs for the true masterpiece of horror he was preparing to create. The autumn of 1937 arrived draped in the colors of dying things, rust-red leaves that carpeted forest floors like dried blood, skeletal branches reaching toward gray skies, and air sharp with the promise of winter's approach. It was in this season of death that Sokrat Kirschvang returned to the world of the living, carrying with him knowledge accumulated through 18 years of careful study and an appetite for violence that had been refined to surgical precision. The journey to his aunt's farm took him through countryside that had changed dramatically during his imprisonment. New roads connected previously isolated communities, telegraph lines brought distant cities within reach of communication, and the mechanization of agriculture had transformed the very landscape he remembered from his youth. But beneath these surface changes, human nature remained as predictable and exploitable as ever. Katerina Kirschvang's farm sat in a valley 20 kilometers outside the city, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense stands of pine and birch. The isolation that had once made it an attractive retreat from urban life would now serve a very different purpose, providing privacy for activities that could not be witnessed by curious neighbors. The farmhouse itself was a modest structure built from local timber and stone, its weathered exterior speaking of decades spent enduring harsh winters and brief summers. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows, creating an image of rustic domesticity that would have seemed welcoming to anyone who didn't know the true nature of the approaching visitor. Kirschvang paused at the edge of the forest, studying the layout of the property with the tactical awareness he had developed during his incarceration. He noted the position of the barn, the location of potential escape routes, the sight lines from various windows. Most importantly, he observed that the nearest neighbor was more than a kilometer away, far enough to ensure that screams would not carry. Katerina emerged from the farmhouse as he approached, her face illuminated by genuine joy at seeing her nephew after so many years. She was 62 years old, her hair silver white and her movements showing the careful precision of age, but her smile was warm and unguarded. Behind her, Nikolai Petrov appeared in the doorway, a sturdy man of 65 whose weathered hands spoke of a lifetime spent working the land. "Sokrat," Katerina called out, her voice carrying across the yard like a bird's song. "You've come home at last." She embraced him with the fierce affection of someone who had genuinely missed him, her arms surprisingly strong despite her age. Kirschvang accepted the embrace, his face arranged in an expression of humble gratitude that masked the calculations running through his mind. He could feel the pulse at her throat, could estimate the exact angle that would be required to sever her carotid artery, could envision the spray pattern that would result. "Aunt Katerina," he murmured, his voice thick with fabricated emotion. "I cannot tell you how much this means to me. After all the darkness, to come home to family." Nikolai approached more cautiously, his farmer's instincts making him naturally wary of strangers, even family. But Katerina's obvious joy in the reunion seemed to reassure him, and he extended his hand in greeting. "Welcome, nephew," he said, his grip firm and honest. "We have prepared a place for you here, for as long as you need it." Kirschvang accepted the handshake, noting the callous texture of the older man's palm, the slight tremor that spoke of age and hard work. Nikolai would be physically stronger than his aunt, but at 65, his reflexes would be slower than they once were. The element of surprise would be crucial. They led him inside the farmhouse, its interior radiating the warmth and comfort of a home that had been lovingly maintained for decades. The furniture was simple but well-made, much of it crafted by Nikolai's own hands during the long winter evenings. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and herb tea, while the sitting room bore the lingering aroma of pipe tobacco and wood smoke. Katerina had prepared a feast in honor of his homecoming: roasted chicken with vegetables from their garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a bottle of wine that they had been saving for a special occasion. As they sat around the kitchen table, she peppered him with questions about his years in prison, his plans for the future, his spiritual transformation. Kirschwang answered each inquiry with carefully crafted responses that reinforced the narrative of redemption he had been developing through years of correspondence. He spoke of long nights spent in prayer, of gradually understanding the enormity of his crimes, of his desperate desire to make amends through honest work and service to others. "The man who committed those terrible acts," he said, his eyes downcast in apparent shame, "that man died in prison. I spent years trying to understand how I could have done such things, how the darkness could have consumed me so completely." Katerina reached across the table to squeeze his hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "We could see the change in your letters, nephew. The pain, but also the growth. You found your way back to the light." Nikolai nodded agreement, though something in his expression suggested lingering reservations. "A man can change," he said slowly, "but change is something that must be proven through actions, not just words." "You're absolutely right, uncle," Kirschwang replied, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "I hope to prove myself worthy of the second chance you're giving me." As the evening progressed, they showed him to the small room they had prepared, a space that had once served as Nikolai's workshop but had been cleared and furnished with a simple bed, dresser, and writing desk. The walls still bore the scent of wood shavings and linseed oil, aromas that triggered powerful memories of his previous life as a craftsman. "We thought you might want to return to woodworking," Katerina explained as she lit the oil lamp beside his bed. "Nikolai has kept all his tools in excellent condition. He would be happy to share them with you." Kirschwang's pulse quickened as his eyes fell upon the tool rack mounted on the far wall. Among the chisels, saws, and planes, he spotted what he had been hoping to find: a carpenter's adze, its curved blade gleaming despite years of storage. The sight of it triggered a physiological response that was almost sexual in its intensity, a flood of anticipation and excitement that he carefully concealed behind a mask of grateful appreciation. "That's very generous," he managed, his voice steady despite the tumult of emotions. "I would like that very much. Working with my hands always brought me peace." After Katerina and Nikolai retired to their bedroom, Kirschwang lay in his narrow bed, staring at the tool rack while his mind raced with possibilities. The ad seemed to call to him across the darkened room, its presence both familiar and intoxicating. He had fantasized about this moment for 18 years, had planned and prepared for it with obsessive dedication. But he forced himself to wait. The years in prison had taught him patience, had shown him the value of careful timing and meticulous preparation. His aunt and uncle needed to become completely comfortable with his presence, needed to lower their guard entirely before he could act. The perfect predator understood that the sweetest prey was that which came to trust completely. For 3 weeks, Kirschwang played the role of the reformed man with Academy Award-worthy performance. He rose early each morning to help with farm chores, his movements efficient and his attitude grateful. He attended the small church in the nearby village, sitting in the back pew with an expression of humble devotion while internally cataloging the vulnerabilities of other worshippers. He worked in Nikolai's workshop during the afternoons, crafting simple items for the household while reacquainting himself with the tools of his trade. His hands remembered the weight and balance of each implement, but it was the adze that commanded most of his attention. He would lift it reverently, testing its edge, practicing the subtle wrist movements that would maximize its effectiveness. "You have good hands for the work," Nikolai observed one afternoon, watching as Kirschwang shaped a chair leg with fluid precision. "It's a gift that stays with a man, no matter how long he's been away from it. The tools remember, even when the man tries to forget," Kirschwang replied, the double meaning lost on his uncle. Each evening, the three of them would share meals prepared by Katerina's skilled hands. She would tell stories of the family's history, of ancestors who had worked this same land for generations, of the cycles of planting and harvest that gave meaning to their lives. Nikolai would speak of practical matters: repairs needed on the barn, preparations for winter, the ever-present concerns of those who lived close to the land. Kirschvang listened to everything with apparent interest, but his real focus was on studying their routines, identifying their patterns of behavior, mapping the rhythms of their daily lives. He learned that Nikolai was a heavy sleeper who required significant noise to wake once he had settled for the night. He discovered that Katerina suffered from arthritis that made her movements predictably slow and painful in the early morning hours. Most importantly, he identified the optimal time for action, that period between 11 and midnight when both elderly people had retired but had not yet fallen into deep sleep. They would be vulnerable but still conscious, able to fully experience what was about to happen to them. The murder weapon posed no challenge. The adze from Nikolai's workshop had been sharpened to razor precision during Kirschvang's daily practice sessions, its blade capable of splitting flesh and bone with surgical efficiency. He had even improved upon its design, subtly modifying the handle's grip to better accommodate his specific hand size and preferred striking angles. On the night he finally decided to act, autumn had surrendered to the first bitter breath of winter. Ice crystals formed on the windows, and the wind moaned through the bare branches like souls in torment. It was weather that would mask sounds, that would keep neighbors indoors, that would provide the perfect acoustic backdrop for the symphony of terror he was preparing to conduct. Kirschvang waited in his room until the farmhouse settled into the deep quiet that marked the boundary between day and night. He could hear Nikolai's heavy breathing through the thin walls, could detect the subtle sounds of Katerina moving restlessly in her bed. The time had come to transform fantasy into reality, to feed the hunger that had been growing within him for nearly 2 decades. He rose from his bed with the fluid silence of a predator, his feet finding the floorboards that would not creak, his movements economical and purposeful. The adze felt perfect in his hands as he lifted it from its rack, its familiar weight triggering a cascade of memories from his previous kills. But this would be different, better, more refined, more artistically satisfying. Nikolai and Katerina's bedroom door stood slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of moonlight to illuminate their sleeping forms. Kirschvang studied them for a long moment, deciding on the sequence of his attacks, visualizing the precise movements that would deliver maximum trauma while ensuring neither victim could escape or summon help. He decided to begin with Nikolai, recognizing that the older man represented the greater physical threat despite his age. The attack needed to be swift and devastating, designed to incapacitate immediately while ensuring that Katerina would witness her husband's destruction before experiencing her own. Kirschvang moved to the side of the bed where Nikolai lay sleeping, his face peaceful in the moonlight, completely unaware that death stood watching him. The curved blade of the adze caught the pale illumination, creating abstract patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance with anticipation. The first blow fell with the precision of a master craftsman, the adze's blade connecting with Nikolai's skull at the optimal angle for maximum penetration. The sound it made was unlike anything in nature, a wet, cracking noise that spoke of bone fracturing and brain tissue pulping. Nikolai's eyes snapped open in the instant before consciousness fled, their expression transforming from confusion to terror to nothing in the space of a heartbeat. But Kirschvang was far from finished. The years of planning, the decades of anticipation, the carefully refined techniques, all of it demanded more than a simple, quick death. This was art, and art required time, patience, and attention to detail. The second blow caught Nikolai across the face, the curved blade peeling away flesh and exposing the bone beneath. Blood sprayed in arterial gouts, painting the bedroom walls in abstract patterns that would have impressed any avant-garde artist. Nikolai's body convulsed, his nervous system firing random signals as his brain struggled to process the catastrophic damage being inflicted upon it. Katerina awakened to the sound of her husband's skull cracking, her eyes opening to witness a scene from the deepest pits of hell. The nephew she had welcomed, the man she had believed redeemed, stood over Nikolai's mutilated body with an expression of profound satisfaction, his face and hands covered in blood, his eyes gleaming with an inhuman light. Her scream began as a whisper of disbelief, rising quickly to a shriek of absolute horror that pierced the night like a blade. But the farmhouse was isolated, the nearest neighbors too distant to hear, and her cries served only to provide a soundtrack for the violence that was still unfolding. Kirschveng turned toward her with deliberate slowness, savoring the terror in her eyes, the way her body trembled with shock and disbelief. This was the moment he had been anticipating for years, the instant when trust transformed into betrayal, when love became the foundation for ultimate violation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Sokrat, please." "Why?" He answered her not with words but with action, the ads describing a perfect arc through the air before connecting with devastating force. But unlike with Nikolai, Kirschveng's assault on his aunt was more methodical, more deliberate. He had learned during his imprisonment that the psychological trauma was often more satisfying than the physical destruction, and Katerina's complete trust made her the perfect subject for an extended demonstration of his refined techniques. The first blow caught her across the shoulder, the blade biting deep enough to shatter the clavicle while leaving her conscious and aware. She screamed again, the sound raw and primal, the cry of an animal caught in a trap. Blood flowed freely from the wound, but Kirschveng had calculated the angle carefully. She would not die quickly. "You welcomed me," he said conversationally, raising the adze for another strike. "You trusted me completely. That trust is what makes this possible." The second blow landed across her ribs, the curved blade sliding between bones with surgical precision. Katerina's breathing became labored, each inhalation a struggle as her punctured lung fought to function. She tried to speak, to plead with the monster who had once been her nephew, but the words emerged only as bloody foam. Kirschveng continued his work with the patience of an artisan, each strike carefully calculated to extend her suffering while ensuring she remained conscious to experience every moment of her destruction. He spoke to her throughout the process, his voice calm and instructional, as if he were explaining the finer points of woodworking technique. "The key," he explained as the adze found her abdomen, "is understanding anatomy, knowing exactly which injuries will kill quickly and which will allow for extended appreciation of the experience." Katerina's body convulsed with each impact, her life ebbing away in carefully measured increments. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the expression on her face, not just pain and terror, but profound confusion, the inability to reconcile the man she had loved with the monster who was systematically destroying her. When she finally died, 27 minutes after the assault began, Kirschveng felt a satisfaction unlike anything he had experienced since his last murders 18 years earlier. This had been better than those crude early attempts, more refined, more artistic, more deeply satisfying on every level. He stood amidst the carnage, the bedroom transformed into an abattoir, blood covering every surface like some grotesque form of interior decoration. Nikolai's body lay twisted and broken, his skull opened like a flower to reveal the destroyed brain tissue within. Katerina's corpse was positioned in a sprawl of ultimate vulnerability, her face frozen in an expression of absolute betrayal. But even as he savored his achievement, Kirschveng's analytical mind was already moving ahead to practical concerns. The bodies would need to be disposed of, the evidence cleaned up, his own escape carefully orchestrated. The years in prison had taught him much about avoiding detection, and he intended to put those lessons to good use. He spent the next 6 hours methodically erasing traces of his presence while preparing the scene to suggest a different narrative entirely. Using techniques he had learned from fellow inmates, he arranged the bodies and bloodstains to suggest a murder-suicide, Nikolai killing his wife in a fit of madness before turning on himself. The adze was cleaned and returned to its place on the tool rack, showing no signs of its recent use. Kirschveng's own clothes were burned in the fireplace, the ashes scattered to prevent any forensic analysis. By dawn, he was ready to leave the farm, carrying only a small bag of valuables he had taken from his victims and the wooden box he had crafted in prison. But before departing, he allowed himself one final moment to appreciate his work. Standing in the doorway of the blood-soaked bedroom, he studied the scene with the critical eye of an artist evaluating his masterpiece. It was beautiful in its way, a testament to the power of patience, planning, and superior technique. The authorities would discover the bodies 3 days later, when Katerina's absence from Sunday church services prompted a concerned neighbor to investigate. The scene they found defied easy explanation, the sheer brutality of the murders suggesting a level of violence that seemed almost inhuman. Detective Inspector Andreas Mueller, the lead investigator assigned to the case, had seen his share of violent crime during 23 years in law enforcement. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the methodical savagery displayed in the Kirschwang farmhouse. The precision of the wounds, the calculated nature of the violence, the almost surgical understanding of anatomy required to inflict such specific trauma, everything suggested a killer with both extensive knowledge and considerable experience. This wasn't random, he told his partner as they surveyed the crime scene. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This is the work of someone who's done this before. The investigation that followed would eventually identify Sokrat Kirschwang as the primary suspect, though by then he had vanished into the labyrinth of post-war Europe like smoke on the wind. But his brief return to freedom had served its purpose, proving that his years of study and preparation had transformed him into something far more dangerous than the crude killer who had entered prison in 1919. The killer with the ads had evolved into the perfect predator, and his appetite for violence was far from satisfied. The massacre at the farm was not an ending but a new beginning, a demonstration of capabilities that promised even greater horrors to come. But fate, as it had before, would intervene to cut short Kirschwang's career. The same investigative persistence that had captured him after his first murders was already beginning to close the net around him once again. The difference this time was that the authorities understood they were not hunting an ordinary criminal, but something far more dangerous, a monster who had learned to perfect his craft through years of careful study and patient preparation. The final chapter of Sokrat Kirschwang's story was about to begin, and it would end not with mercy or redemption, but with the justice that had been too long delayed. The manhunt that followed the discovery of the farmhouse massacre was unlike anything the region's law enforcement had ever undertaken. Detective Inspector Andreas Mueller understood from the moment he walked into that blood-soaked bedroom that he was tracking a predator whose capabilities far exceeded those of common criminals. The precision of the wounds, the calculated brutality, the almost surgical understanding of human anatomy, everything pointed to a killer who had refined murder into a dark art form. Mueller was a methodical man, shaped by 2 decades of police work that had taught him the value of patience and attention to detail. At 51 years old, his graying hair and weathered face spoke of countless hours spent pursuing criminals through the shadowy corners of human behavior. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for the methodical savagery he found at the Kirschwang farm. "Look at this," he said to his partner, Detective Sergeant Klaus Weber, as they studied the wound patterns on Nikolai's corpse. "These aren't random strikes. Each blow was calculated for maximum effect. The killer knew exactly where to hit to cause specific types of damage." Weber, younger and less experienced, struggled to maintain his composure in the face of such overwhelming violence. The bedroom resembled a slaughterhouse more than a crime scene, blood covering surfaces in patterns that suggested both frenzied activity and careful planning. Could it be gang-related? Weber suggested, grasping for explanations that might make sense of the carnage. Some kind of territorial dispute? Mueller shook his head, his experienced eye reading details that his partner had missed. Gang killings are about sending messages. Quick, brutal, efficient. This is something else entirely. This is someone who enjoyed what they were doing, who took their time to savor the experience. The breakthrough came when Mueller discovered the family connection between the victims and their nephew, Sokrat Kirschwang. A quick check of prison records revealed Kirschwang's recent release after serving 18 years for double murders committed with a carpenter's adze, the same type of weapon that had been used at the farm. "He's back," Mueller breathed, the pieces falling into place with terrifying clarity. The killer with the adze has returned. The realization sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Kirschwang's original crimes had become legendary among police officers, studied in training sessions as examples of methodical brutality. The fact that he had been released from prison rather than executed was seen as a catastrophic failure of the justice system. But Mueller quickly realized that hunting this particular predator would require resources and techniques beyond anything currently available to his department. Kirschwang had spent 18 years in prison learning from other criminals, studying investigative methods, and preparing for exactly this situation. He would not be caught through conventional police work. The inspector reached out to colleagues in neighboring jurisdictions, sharing information about the case and requesting assistance in tracking the fugitive. He also contacted Professor Heinrich Brenner, a criminologist at the University of Vienna who had made a specialty of studying violent offenders. Professor Brenner arrived at the crime scene 3 days after the bodies were discovered, his academic credentials providing him access that would normally be denied to civilians. At 64 years old, he was one of Europe's leading experts on criminal psychology, having studied dozens of cases involving serial killers and mass murderers. His reaction to the farmhouse massacre was immediate and unsettling. Rather than the revulsion most people displayed when confronted with such violence, Brenner showed the clinical fascination of a scientist encountering a particularly interesting specimen. "Remarkable," he murmured, studying the wound patterns with a magnifying glass. "The evolution is extraordinary. Compare these injuries to photographs from his 1919 murders, and you can see clear evidence of technical improvement." Mueller found the professor's detached analysis disturbing but potentially valuable. "What can you tell us about his psychological state, his likely behavior patterns?" Brenner straightened, his eyes bright with intellectual excitement. Kirschwang represents a fascinating case study in criminal development. His 18 years in prison didn't rehabilitate him, they educated him. He's learned to be more patient, more methodical, more psychologically sophisticated. The professor's analysis proved prophetic when reports began filtering in from across the region of similar violent crimes. A traveling merchant found butchered in his wagon, his skull split open with surgical precision. A widow discovered in her cottage, her body bearing the unmistakable signature wounds of an adze-wielding killer. Each crime scene bore evidence of the same methodical approach, the same calculated brutality that had characterized the farmhouse massacre. But Kirschwang was not simply killing at random. Mueller's investigation revealed a pattern to his victim selection that suggested careful planning and psychological sophistication. Each target was chosen for specific reasons: isolation that would prevent discovery, wealth that could fund his continued activities, personal characteristics that made them psychologically appealing to a particular type of predator. The killer was moving in a roughly circular pattern, never staying in one area long enough to establish a clear trail, but always remaining within a geographic region that he obviously knew well. His choices of hiding places showed intimate knowledge of local terrain, suggesting years of careful study and preparation. "He's not running randomly," Mueller explained to the task force that had been assembled to capture Kirschwang. "He's following a predetermined plan, probably developed during his years in prison. Every move is calculated, every decision made for maximum advantage." The investigation was complicated by the social and political chaos that gripped the region in 1937. Economic instability had created waves of displaced persons, making it difficult to track individual movements. Communication between different police jurisdictions was sporadic and unreliable. Most importantly, many citizens were reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement, viewing police officers as representatives of an oppressive system rather than protectors of public safety. But Detective Mueller possessed two advantages that would prove crucial in the hunt for Kirschwang. First, his methodical approach to investigation allowed him to see patterns that others missed, to connect seemingly unrelated incidents into a coherent narrative of predatory behavior. Second, his understanding of criminal psychology enabled him to anticipate Kirschwang's likely actions and motivations. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: Maria Kowalski, an elderly woman who operated a small inn in the mountain village of Dragomir. She contacted police after recognizing a newspaper photograph of Kirschwang as identical to a guest who had stayed at her establishment 3 weeks earlier. "He was very polite," she told Mueller during their interview. "Quiet, well-mannered, paid his bill without complaint. But there was something about his eyes. They were cold like a snake's eyes. He watched everything, studied everyone, as if he were making calculations." More importantly, Maria remembered that Kirschwang had asked detailed questions about the surrounding area: which roads led where, which houses were occupied by elderly residents, which families had valuable possessions. At the time, she had attributed his curiosity to simple interest in local history. Now, in the context of the murder investigation, his questions took on a far more sinister significance. Mueller's team descended on Dragomir with the urgency of hunters pursuing dangerous prey. They interviewed every resident, searched every building, followed every possible lead. But Kirschvang had vanished once again, leaving behind only traces of his presence and the lingering fear that he inspired in everyone who had encountered him. The investigation revealed that during his stay in Dragomir, Kirschvang had carefully scouted potential victims and escape routes. He had identified 3 separate families that met his criteria for vulnerability and wealth. He had mapped the local road system, noting which paths could be traveled at night without attracting attention. Most chillingly, he had acquired additional tools from the village blacksmith, items that could only be intended for use in future murders. "He's planning something big," Professor Brenner warned Mueller during one of their consultations. "The pattern suggests he's no longer satisfied with individual murders. He wants something more spectacular, more psychologically gratifying." The professor's analysis proved accurate when reports came in of a massacre at the Novak family compound, a prosperous farm located in an isolated valley 20 kilometers from Dragomir. The crime scene surpassed even the farmhouse murders in its sheer brutality and methodical execution. The Novak family had consisted of 7 members, parents, 3 adult children, and 2 grandchildren aged 8 and 12. All had been murdered with the same surgical precision that characterized Kirschvang's previous work. But the scale of the violence suggested a killer who had moved beyond simple murder into something resembling ritualistic slaughter. The positioning of the bodies indicated that Kirschvang had forced the family to watch as he systematically murdered each member, saving the children for last to maximize the psychological trauma experienced by the parents. The wounds showed clear evidence of his evolving technique, more precise, more devastating, more artistically arranged than anything he had done before. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Kirschvang had spent considerable time at the scene after completing the murders. He had arranged the bodies in specific poses, had painted symbols on the walls using their blood, had even prepared and consumed a meal in the kitchen while surrounded by the corpses of his victims. "This isn't just murder anymore," Mueller told his superiors during an emergency briefing. "This is a man who has completely lost touch with any recognizable form of human morality. He's become something else entirely, a predator that views other people as nothing more than raw material for his artistic expression." The Novak massacre triggered a massive response from law enforcement agencies across the region. Military units were deployed to assist in the search, roadblocks were established on every major route, and a reward was offered that attracted hundreds of civilian volunteers to the manhunt. But Kirschvang continued to evade capture with an almost supernatural ability to disappear into the landscape. Witnesses reported seeing him in a dozen different locations, but each sighting proved to be either mistaken identity or evidence that he had already moved on to another hiding place. The breakthrough finally came through an unexpected avenue, the criminal underworld that Kirschvang had encountered during his prison years. Several of his former cellmates had maintained connections to organized crime networks that operated throughout the region. When police offered substantial rewards for information leading to Kirschvang's capture, these connections began to provide valuable intelligence. A fence named Viktor Petrov, who specialized in disposing of stolen goods for various criminal enterprises, contacted Mueller with information about a recent transaction. 3 days after the Novak murders, someone matching Kirschvang's description had attempted to sell jewelry and other valuables clearly taken from the crime scene. "He was nervous," Petrov reported, kept looking over his shoulder, jumped at every sound. But there was something else, something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I've dealt with killers before, but this was different. This was like looking into the eyes of something that wasn't quite human anymore. More importantly, Petrov was able to provide information about Kirschvang's likely destination. The killer had asked about routes leading toward the border, about contacts who could provide false identification papers, about safe houses where someone could hide indefinitely. Mueller realized that Kirschvang was planning to flee the region entirely, probably intending to establish himself in a new location where he could continue his killing spree without the pressure of an intensive manhunt. The detective understood that if the killer succeeded in escaping, he would likely never be caught, and dozens of innocent people would die as a result. The final confrontation took place at an abandoned monastery in the mountains, a Gothic structure that had been empty for decades but still provided shelter for those seeking to avoid detection. Acting on intelligence provided by Petrov's criminal network, Mueller's team surrounded the building during the early morning hours, when mist clung to the valley floor like ghostly fingers. The monastery itself was a haunting sight. Broken windows stared like empty eye sockets, crumbling walls bore the scars of age and neglect, and the bell tower stood silent against the gray sky. It was the perfect hiding place for someone who had embraced darkness as completely as Sokrat Kirschvang. Mueller approached the main entrance with extreme caution, his weapon drawn and his senses alert for any sign of danger. His team had positioned themselves at all possible exits, but the detective understood that Kirschvang was far too dangerous to underestimate. The killer had survived 18 years in prison and evaded capture for months. He would not surrender easily. The confrontation, when it came, was both anticlimactic and terrifying. Mueller found Kirschvang in the monastery's main chapel, kneeling before the ruined altar with his beloved adze laid across his knees like a religious artifact. The killer looked up as the detective entered, his face bearing an expression of profound serenity. "Inspector Mueller," he said calmly, as if he had been expecting the visit. "I wondered when you would find me." The detective kept his weapon trained on the killer while studying his demeanor for any sign of impending violence. Kirschvang appeared completely relaxed, almost meditative, but Mueller had read the crime scene reports. He knew exactly what this seemingly mild man was capable of doing. "Sokrat Kirschvang," he said formally, "you are under arrest for the murders of Katerina Kirschvang, Nikolai Petrov, and 7 members of the Novak family. You have the right to—" Kirschvang's laugh cut through the detective's words like a blade. It was not the sound of madness or desperation, but of genuine amusement, as if he found the entire situation deeply entertaining. "Rights?" he said, rising slowly to his feet while keeping the adze in his hands. "Inspector, I gave up any claim to rights the moment I picked up this tool. I chose to become something beyond the reach of your laws and moral conventions." Mueller tightened his grip on his weapon, recognizing the signs of a predator preparing to strike. But Kirschvang made no aggressive moves, instead speaking with the calm rationality of someone discussing a minor philosophical point. "Do you want to know how many I've killed, Inspector? Not just the ones you found, but all of them? The count is higher than you imagine. Much higher." The detective felt a chill that had nothing to do with the monastery's ancient stones. "How many?" he asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answer. Kirschvang smiled, the expression transforming his face into something that belonged in nightmares. "Does it matter? I stopped counting after the first dozen. They all blur together after a while. The screams, the blood, the moment when they finally understand that there will be no mercy." The killer's confession continued for several minutes, a rambling discourse on violence and death that revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration. But throughout his monologue, Mueller noticed that Kirschvang's grip on the adze was gradually shifting, his body positioning changing in subtle ways that suggested preparation for an attack. When the strike finally came, it was with the lightning speed of a cobra. Kirschvang lunged forward, the curved blade of the adze describing a perfect arc toward Mueller's skull. But the detective's years of experience and careful observation had prepared him for exactly this moment. Mueller's pistol barked twice in rapid succession, the reports echoing through the ruined chapel like thunder. Both bullets found their target, striking Kirschvang's center mass with devastating effect. The killer's forward momentum carried him several more steps before he collapsed, the adze clattering across the stone floor as his fingers lost their grip. Sokrat Kirschvang lay dying on the chapel floor, blood spreading beneath him like a crimson halo. But even as life ebbed from his body, his eyes remained fixed on the adze that had served him so faithfully. His lips curved in a slight smile that spoke of no regret for the horrors he had committed. "The tool remembers," he whispered with his final breath, the words barely audible in the vast emptiness of the ruined monastery. "Even when the craftsman is gone, the tool remembers." Detective Mueller stood over the killer's body for a long moment, ensuring that the nightmare was finally over. Then he carefully retrieved the adze, wrapping it in cloth before carrying it outside to be processed as evidence. The weapon would eventually be destroyed, but not before being studied by forensic experts who hoped to understand how an ordinary carpenter's tool had been transformed into an instrument of such extraordinary evil. The investigation into Kirschfang's crimes continued for months after his death, as authorities worked to identify all of his victims and provide closure to grieving families. The final count was never definitively established, but evidence suggested that the killer with the adze had murdered at least 15 people during his 2 separate killing sprees, with the possibility that additional victims remained undiscovered. Professor Brenner published a comprehensive analysis of the case that became required reading for criminology students across Europe. His study of Kirschfang's psychological evolution, criminal methodology, and victim selection patterns provided valuable insights into the mind of a serial killer and the factors that could transform an ordinary person into a monster. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Kirschfang case was the demonstration that justice, even when delayed, could ultimately prevail. The killer's 18-year prison sentence had been intended as mercy, a chance for rehabilitation and redemption. Instead, it had merely postponed the inevitable reckoning while allowing him to become an even more dangerous predator. The farmhouse where Katerina Kirschfang and Nikolai Petrov had been murdered was eventually demolished, the land sold to developers who had no interest in preserving the site of such tragedy. The monastery where Kirschfang met his end remained abandoned, though local residents reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that kept most visitors away. And somewhere in the evidence rooms of various police departments, the tools of Kirschfang's trade remained as silent testimony to the capacity for human evil. The adze that had taken so many lives was eventually melted down and destroyed, but the memory of what it had accomplished would live on in the nightmares of those who had witnessed its work. Sokrat Kirschfang was dead, but his legacy lived on as a reminder that monsters can walk among us wearing familiar faces, that the most ordinary tools can become instruments of extraordinary evil, and that the darkness in human nature is always waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The killer with the adze had finally been stopped, but the questions raised by his crimes would haunt investigators and criminologists for generations to come. In the end, perhaps that was his most disturbing achievement, not just the lives he had taken, but the innocence he had destroyed in everyone who learned of his deeds. Justice had been served, but at a cost that could never be fully calculated. And in the shadows cast by his terrible legacy, other predators were already learning from his example, studying his methods, and preparing to continue the dark work he had begun. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.